He was just a lifeguard. That's what they thought. That was their final mistake. Three men in suits were cornering a young woman against a wall beside an infinity pool, 40 stories high above Miami. Hundreds of VIPs stood around. No one moved. Cameras were off. Bodyguards had been escorted away. And the only one who realized what was happening was a man in a white uniform, silently standing beside a lifeguard's chair, watching it all from the beginning. If you're watching this, hit like and comment your city below. I want to know how far this story has traveled in the world. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will keep you glued to the screen. The elevator doors opened at 10:47 p.m., and Caleb Ryder stepped onto the rooftop with a fresh stack of folded towels tucked under one arm and a cup of coffee going cold in his other hand. He wasn't supposed to be here. Technically, his shift ended at 10. But Marissa, the girl who was supposed to cover the rooftop pool station for the gala, had texted him at 9:50 saying her kid had a fever and she needed to leave, and could he please stay just a couple more hours? He'd said yes before she finished the sentence. That was the thing about Caleb. He always said yes when it mattered, and almost never when it didn't. He set the towels on the cart near the entrance, took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, and looked out at the scene in front of him. The Aurelius Hotel's rooftop terrace was something that belonged in a different world than the one Caleb usually occupied. 40 floors above Biscayne Bay, the space had been transformed for the evening into something out of a movie. String lights strung overhead like low stars. White linen tables draped with orchids flown in from somewhere that wasn't Miami. A jazz quartet playing near the bar with the kind of effortless cool that only comes from decades of practice. The infinity pool itself glowed electric blue at the far end of the terrace, its edge disappearing seamlessly into the dark horizon of the Atlantic beyond. About 300 guests moved through the space in clusters. Investors and hedge fund managers, and tech executives, and the particular breed of Miami socialite who seemed to exist only at parties like this. The women wore things that cost more than Caleb's monthly rent. The men shook hands the way men shake hands when they're keeping score. Caleb had worked at the Aurelius for 14 months. He'd learned early that if you wore the white polo shirt and kept the lanyard visible and moved with purpose, nobody looked at you twice. You became furniture. Background. Part of the hotel's architecture. That invisibility didn't bother him anymore. In a previous life, it had been a skill. Now it was just Tuesday. He walked to the pool station, checked the chemical kit, logged the readings into the clipboard he'd need to file later, and settled into the elevated chair with his coffee. From up here, he could see the whole terrace. He'd chosen this chair on his very first day for exactly that reason. Old habits. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. "Dad, Lily knocked over her water on my homework. She says it was an accident, but I watched her do it on purpose. This is a crisis." A smile broke across his face before he could stop it. "Okay," he typed back. "First, is Lily okay? Second, how bad is the damage? Third, you're 9 years old. Everything feels like a crisis at 9. It gets worse at 10, just so you're prepared." 3 dots appeared. "She's fine, unfortunately. The homework is soggy, but readable. And thanks, Dad, very helpful. That's what I'm here for," he typed. "Lights out by 10:30. I'll be home by midnight. Love you both." "Ugh, fine. Love you too." He pocketed the phone and looked back out at the party. That was his world. Soggy homework and bedtime negotiations, and the specific kind of chaos that comes with raising 2 kids in a 1-bedroom plus den apartment in Hialeah, which he'd converted the den into a room for Lily by hanging a curtain down the middle and calling it a studio. Emma, who was 12 and deeply unimpressed by everything, slept in the actual bedroom. Caleb slept on the pull-out couch and told himself it was temporary. It had been temporary for 2 years now. He didn't think about the other life much. The one before Miami, before the hotel, before the pull-out couch. He'd made a choice, and he was at peace with it most of the time. Tonight, though, something in the air was making the back of his neck itch, in a way it hadn't itched in a long time. He scanned the terrace again, slower this time, methodical. Sienna Holloway was laughing at something Gerald Whitmore had said, but she wasn't really listening to him. She was good at that, performing the version of herself that the room required while the actual version of herself ran quiet calculations behind her eyes. 29 years old when she'd taken the CEO seat at Holloway Group after her father's stroke. 30 now, and she'd spent the last 12 months fighting every single day to prove that the company hadn't died when he stopped being able to run it. Gerald was saying something about the Meridian deal and why it made sense to wait. Gerald was always saying something about why it made sense to wait. He was 63 years old and had been on the board since before Sienna was born, and he smiled at her the way a man smiles at someone he doesn't entirely believe is real. The market timing, Gerald was explaining, swirling his scotch, is simply not. The market timing is fine, Gerald, Sienna kept her voice pleasant. The Meridian deal closes in 6 weeks or we lose the window. I've shown you the projections 3 times. And they're impressive projections. He nodded, the way you nod at a child's drawing. But the board has concerns about... The board's concerns are noted. She touched his arm, briefly, the social shorthand for we're done with this part of the conversation. I'd love to talk more after dinner. Excuse me. She moved away from him through the crowd, smiling at faces as she passed them, doing the math in her head. She needed at least 6 of the 9 board votes to hold position. She had 4 that she was certain of, 2 more that she thought she could get. The rest were Gerald's people, and Gerald's people went wherever Gerald's money pointed. She needed tonight to go perfectly. That was the thought that was in her head when she spotted Marcus Vane across the terrace. He was standing near the bar with 2 men she didn't recognize, both of them big, the kind of broad-shouldered bulk that doesn't come from a gym so much as from something more deliberate. Marcus himself was lean, mid-50s, silver at his temples. He was dressed better than almost anyone in the room, which was saying something. He held his champagne glass with the casual authority of a man who'd never once in his life had to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. Marcus Vane was the founder and CEO of Vane Capital Partners, which had been quietly accumulating Holloway Group shares for the past 8 months. He hadn't said publicly what he intended to do with those shares. He didn't have to say. Everyone in the room who understood the game already knew. Sienna watched him for 3 seconds, then looked away. She'd known he was on the guest list. She'd invited him herself, actually. Keep your enemies close was a philosophy she'd inherited from her father, along with the company and the debts and the particular headache of running a family business that the world had decided shouldn't belong to her. She found her head of security near the entrance to the terrace, a stocky, precise man named Garrett Cole, ex-NYPD, who'd been with Holloway Group Security for 6 years. Vane brought +2s, she said quietly, stopping beside him without looking at him. I know, Garrett said. I checked them in, cleared. Both registered as associates of Vane Capital. They're not associates I've ever seen in any photo. People have associates you don't know about. Garrett. She looked at him now. I don't need reassurance. I need you watching. That's what I'm doing. He met her eyes briefly. Enjoy the party, Sienna. She didn't find that particularly comforting, but she nodded and moved back into the crowd. Caleb saw the woman in the white dress first. He'd clocked her maybe 20 minutes after arriving at the rooftop. She was hard not to clock, not because of the dress or the way she looked, but because of the way she moved. Most people at a party like this moved in a kind of performed drift, following the social currents. She moved with intention. She knew where she was going before she started going there, and she was cataloging the room as she traveled through it. He'd recognized the habit because it was his. He'd done some minimal digging through the only available information. The brass placard at the entrance to the terrace had read, Holloway Group Annual Investor Gala, and the hotel's internal event notes that had been distributed to staff had a headshot of the host. Sienna Holloway, CEO. That was the woman in the white dress. For the first 40 minutes, he'd watched the party the way he always watched rooms. Not with any particular alarm, just the low-grade surveillance that had been part of him for long enough that he didn't know how to turn it off. The way some people can't not notice when music is slightly out of tune. Then, around 11:15, 3 things happened in quick succession that changed the nature of his attention. First, he noticed Garrett Cole, the stocky security man near the entrance who'd been doing his own quiet scanning, have a brief, low conversation with one of the bartenders. Then Garrett walked toward the interior stairwell and disappeared. Second, the security camera mounted on the pillar near the bar, which had been tracking slowly left and right all evening, stopped moving, just stopped. The little indicator light that blinked when it was active went dark. Third, The two large men who'd arrived with Marcus Vane detached from him and began moving separately through the crowd, in directions that, if you were watching from above, and mapping trajectories the way Caleb's brain automatically mapped trajectories, were going to converge at a specific point near the far end of the pool. The point where Sienna Holloway was currently standing, alone, looking out at the water. Caleb set down his coffee. He didn't stand up yet. He sat very still and watched, because he'd learned a long time ago that the difference between a situation and a problem was about 30 seconds of careful observation. If you moved too soon, you turned a misread into an incident. If you waited too long, it became something else. He counted seconds. Marcus Vane set down his champagne glass and began moving toward the pool end of the terrace. That's 3 vectors, Caleb thought. Not 2. 3. And they're not converging on the pool. They're converging on her. He was off the lifeguard chair with his coffee still rocking on the armrest. "You came," Sienna said. When Marcus Vane materialized at her side, she kept her voice neutral. Friendly, even. Out here near the pool's edge, the noise of the party was softer, just the low pulse of conversation and the jazz quartet doing something slow. The water glowed. The city sprawled below them, indifferent and enormous. "You invited me," Vane said. His voice was the kind of smooth that takes years to cultivate. Not naturally smooth, but deliberate, like a surface that had been sanded down repeatedly. "I did." She turned to face him. "I thought it was time we spoke directly instead of through lawyers and SEC filings. I've always preferred direct conversation." He glanced sideways briefly. "Beautiful view." "It is." She waited. He looked at her with something that was almost, but not quite, admiration. "You've done remarkable things with your father's company, Sienna. I mean that genuinely. Most people who inherit a business in the condition Holloway Group was in 18 months ago would have sold the assets and moved on. I'm not most people." "No." He smiled. "You're not. Which is exactly why what I'm about to propose makes sense." She felt the presence before she identified it, a shift in the air at her left side, and she turned slightly to find one of Vane's large associates standing closer than he'd been a moment ago. The second one materialized to her right, not aggressive, not yet, just positioned, like bookends. The rooftop was full of people, but suddenly the space immediately around her felt strangely empty. The nearest guest 10 feet away, all of them absorbed in their own conversations, facing away. She understood in a cold, precise instant that this hadn't happened by accident. "This is a very public place for a private conversation," she said carefully. "That's what makes it elegant," Vane said. "Nobody's going to make a scene at a party. No one ever does." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This is a proxy agreement. It transfers voting rights on your personal shares, which I understand represent roughly 23% of outstanding stock, to a trust that I control, effective immediately." Sienna looked at the document. She didn't take it. "You're asking me to hand you the company. I'm asking you to hand it to someone who can actually protect it from what's coming." "What's coming?" "The Meridian deal collapses in 3 weeks. I have it on good authority." He said it quietly, conversationally, just 2 people talking business by the pool. "When it does, your board votes to remove you. 6 of 9. Gerald Whitmore's already drafted the resolution." He tilted his head. "Or you sign this tonight. I assume control of the vote. The board transition happens on my terms, not theirs. You walk away with your family name intact and your equity stake protected." "Walk away," Sienna repeated, "with $38 million and your reputation." His voice didn't change. "That's not nothing." She looked at the document again. The man on her left had shifted maybe 6 inches closer. Barely perceptible, but she noticed it, and she understood what it meant. "Take it," Vane said quietly. The word was still framed as a suggestion, but the architecture of the conversation had changed. "Don't make this into something it doesn't have to be." Sienna's heartbeat was very steady. She was proud of that. She was terrified, and she was angry, and her mind was running the calculations at speed, but her heartbeat was steady. She thought about calling out. She thought about the distance to the nearest group of guests. She thought about Garrett, who should have been 15 feet behind her right now, and wasn't. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from slightly behind and to the left of Vane. Calm, unhurried, the kind of quiet that takes up space. Caleb had covered the distance across the terrace in about 45 seconds, taking a route that kept him behind the bar and along the far railing, staying out of the sight lines of both associates until he was close enough. He'd been watching the whole approach, the document, the repositioning, the way the man on her left had moved to cut off her most natural exit route. He'd also been watching the associate on her right's hands, which hadn't moved toward anything, not yet, but which had the particular stillness of hands that are waiting. He stepped to a position about 8 feet from Marcus Vane, towels and lanyard visible, and said, "Is there a problem here?" and watched all three of them turn. The associate on Sienna's right assessed him in about half a second and dismissed him in the next half second. Caleb watched the dismissal happen. White polo shirt, lanyard, laminated staff badge that said pool safety above his name. 6'1", 190, looked like someone who checked chemical levels and told drunk guests not to run. "Staff," the associate said, and his voice carried the specific contempt of someone who'd spent a long time sorting people into categories and operating accordingly. "Walk away." "I don't think I will," Caleb said. Vane studied him, slightly longer. "This is a private conversation. Hotel staff should—" "The lady looks like she wants to leave," Caleb said. "Do you want to leave, ma'am?" Sienna Holloway stared at him. This man in the white polo shirt with the coffee-stained cuff and the calm, dark eyes, who had appeared from nowhere and was currently standing between her and 3 people who were trying to take everything she had built. "Yes," she said. "I do." "Then let's walk," Caleb said, and took a step forward. The associate on her right moved first. He came in fast and low. Someone who'd done this before, knew how to move without telegraphing, expected that what was in front of him would fold under the pressure of 220 pounds moving at speed. What happened next took about 4 seconds. It didn't look like a fight. It didn't have the wild, crashing energy of what most people imagine when they picture violence. It was more like watching someone solve a problem in real time, a precise, minimal application of specific knowledge. Caleb deflected the grab, redirected the man's momentum using his own weight against him, and put him down on the pool deck in a controlled way that was more about physics than force. The associate hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of him, not hard enough to do anything permanent. The second associate came from the left with more caution. He'd seen the first one go down and recalibrated. He was bigger. He was smart enough to slow down. Caleb didn't give him time to formulate a plan. 3 seconds. Down. Vane stepped back. He hadn't moved toward Caleb, hadn't reached for anything. He was the kind of man who thought several steps ahead, and he was currently thinking. "You have no idea," Vane said quietly, "what you've just involved yourself in." "Sure I don't," Caleb said. He wasn't breathing hard. "Document on the ground. Step back from her." Vane looked at him for a long moment. Then he let the document fall. The whole rooftop had gone quiet. 300 people stood frozen, jazz quartet included. Every face turned toward the pool end of the terrace, where a lifeguard in a white polo shirt was standing over 2 large men on the ground while the host of the party stood beside him, and Marcus Vane stared at them both with cold, precise fury. Nobody said anything. Caleb turned to Sienna. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Okay." He pulled out his phone and handed it to her. "Call 911. The police took 22 minutes to arrive, which felt longer than it was. In those 22 minutes, several things happened. Vane's 2 associates stayed on the ground, not because they couldn't get up. One of them probably could have, but because Caleb had positioned himself in a way that made the cost-benefit of getting up feel unappealing. And because one of the guests, a woman in her 60s who turned out to be a federal prosecutor at parties like this, had begun recording on her phone the moment she'd turned around and seen what was happening. The guests, collectively, seemed unsure what they'd just witnessed. The prevailing theory for the first few minutes, spreading in whispers through the crowd, was that someone had had too much to drink and there'd been an altercation. Then a man near the bar said, "Wait, did he just take down both of them?" And the recalibration began. Sienna stood about 4 feet from Caleb and did not go back to mingling. She stood exactly where she was and kept her eyes on Vane, who had moved to a seat near the bar and was speaking quietly into his phone. "What's your name?" she asked Caleb without looking at him. "Caleb Ryder." "How long have you worked here?" 14 months. She finally looked at him. He was looking at Vane. "You were watching me." I was watching the room. That's not an accident. He considered that. Old habit. What kind of old habit involves taking down two armed men and not breaking a sweat? He was quiet for a moment. The kind you don't talk about at parties. The federal prosecutor. Her name was Linda Marsh, and she would later become one of the most important witnesses in the investigation, made her way through the crowd and stopped near them. She looked at Caleb with an expression that said she was reclassifying what she'd assumed was a hotel employee. That was military, she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb didn't confirm or deny. He said, Ma'am, can you keep people back from that area until police arrive? And gestured at the two men on the ground. She nodded slowly, still watching him. Absolutely. When the police arrived, Caleb gave his account in the precise, organized way of someone accustomed to writing after-action reports. Dates, times, specific observations, the sequence of events, the exact words that had been spoken. The officer taking notes kept looking up from his pad with an expression that was having trouble finding a category for what he was hearing. At some point during the witness statements, a young officer checked the internal security system and reported back that the rooftop cameras had been manually disabled at 10:52 p.m., about 3 minutes before the confrontation at the pool. The disable command had been entered using Garrett Cole's credentials. Garrett Cole, it turned out, had not gone home. He was found sitting in a car in the hotel parking garage, on a phone call that was still in progress when two officers knocked on the window. Sienna heard this and stood very still for about 5 seconds. Garrett's been with us for 6 years, she said to no one in particular. Caleb was nearby. He said nothing because there wasn't anything useful to say to that. At 1:30 in the morning, the last guests had been interviewed and released. The two associates were in custody. Vane had been detained for questioning, and the Aurelius's rooftop was quieter than it had been all night. The hotel's general manager, a thin Frenchman named Renaud, who had the haunted look of someone whose evening had gone extremely wrong, was apologizing to Sienna repeatedly. She wasn't really listening. She was sitting on the edge of a pool chair with her heels off and her feet on the tile, holding a glass of water that had gone warm, looking at nothing. Caleb was at the pool station, filling out his incident report, because the hotel still required an incident report regardless of whatever else had happened. She watched him for a moment. He was writing in the careful, slightly cramped hand of someone who'd been trained to get things right. He hadn't asked anyone for anything. He hadn't talked to the press, the 3 reporters who'd appeared at the service entrance once word started circulating. He hadn't accepted the offer of a free drink from 3 separate guests. He'd spoken when spoken to, answered what was asked, and otherwise just worked. Filed papers. Did the job. She got up and walked over to him. The police are going to need your contact information, she said. I gave it to them. My legal team is going to want to speak with you as well. That's fine. She stood next to the cart and watched him write for a moment. Do you have somewhere to be? He checked his watch. I have 2 kids at home. Babysitter cut off at midnight, but she's my neighbor, so she's flexible. He paused. I should get home soon, yeah. How old? 12 and 5. She absorbed that. You're a single parent. Yes. I didn't know that. No reason you would. He closed the clipboard. You're the CEO. I'm the guy by the pool. She looked at him directly. He had a face that had been in weather. Not old, but experienced, lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into sun or salt air or both. The calm that had been there all night was still there, but something else was visible now too, something quieter. The kind of tiredness that isn't about the current night, but about accumulation. You didn't have to step in, she said. That wasn't your job. He considered that for a moment like he was genuinely thinking about it. Maybe not officially. You could have called security. Security was the problem. She smiled at that, briefly, despite herself. Fair. He gathered the clipboard and the chemical kit. You should have someone you trust go through your board communications for the past 60 days. If Whitmore was coordinating with Vane and Cole, there'll be a trail. There's always a trail. He said it simply, the way someone says the pool closes at 10. Get your lawyers on it tonight, not tomorrow. She stared at him. How do you know that's the right move? I don't, necessarily. But if the other side had 60 days to set this up, you've already lost some ground you need to recover. She looked at him for a long moment. Who are you, Caleb Ryder? He picked up the cart handle. Lifeguard, he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not quite humor, not quite deflection, something in between, that told her she wasn't going to get a fuller answer tonight. I'll be in touch about the legal team, she said. He nodded. Tell them daytime hours are better. The kids are in school. He walked the cart toward the service elevator. She watched him go. The rooftop was empty now except for the cleanup crew beginning to break down the tables, and the two police officers finishing their walkthrough, and the jazz quartet's abandoned instruments still sitting on their stands like a question nobody had answered. Sienna picked up her heels from the pool chair and stood barefoot on the warm tile and looked out at the city below. The arterials of light, the dark water, the distant flicker of planes descending toward MYA. She was still the CEO of Holloway Group. She wasn't sure how exactly, because an hour ago she'd been standing at the edge of a pool with a document in front of her and two large men on either side, and the very specific feeling of watching a door close. Then a lifeguard had appeared out of nowhere and opened it back up. The kind you don't talk about at parties. She thought about that. She put her shoes back on and called her lawyer. Caleb got home at 2:17 in the morning. The apartment was quiet. The light above the stove was on, the one he always left on, so the kitchen wasn't completely dark when he came in late. He stood in the entry for a moment, doing the thing he always did when he got home, just listening to the specific quality of the silence, the particular breathing quiet of a place where people are sleeping safely. He'd done this in other places, in other kinds of silence. He tried not to think about that. He checked on Lily first because Lily was 5 and sometimes got herself turned completely sideways in the night. She was fine, twisted around with her feet toward the pillow, which was her preferred position, her stuffed seal tucked under her arm. He straightened the blanket and she made a sound without waking up. Emma's door, the curtain, technically, but they called it a door, was closed. He could hear the specific breathing that meant she was asleep and not pretending to be asleep, which was a distinction he'd learned to make during the first terrible year of being her only parent, when she'd been 10 and furious and heartbroken and had spent a lot of nights pretending to sleep so she wouldn't have to talk to him. She was better now. Not fine. He didn't think 12-year-old girls who'd lost their mothers were ever exactly fine, but better. She could look at pictures of Rachel now without leaving the room. That was progress. He changed out of the uniform in the bathroom, washed his face, looked at himself in the mirror for a moment. The face that looked back was unremarkable. Tired. The thing about the face in the mirror was that it didn't show you what you'd seen, what you'd done, the geography of all the years that had made you whatever you currently were. He went to the couch and unfolded it without turning on a light and lay down and looked at the ceiling. He thought about the rooftop, the 3 vectors of approach, the specific way the first associate had moved, military or close to it, but not current, muscle memory that had softened at the edges from months or years of not practicing. The second one had been smarter, but slower. Neither of them had expected what they'd encountered. Nobody expected the guy by the pool. He thought about Sienna Holloway standing barefoot on the pool tile, holding a glass of water, and telling him he hadn't had to step in. He thought about the way she'd looked at him when he'd said, "Get your lawyers on it tonight," like she was trying to find the seams of something that didn't have visible seams. He thought about what was coming for her, because the thing about tonight was that tonight had been the opening move, not the whole game. Whoever had engineered this, and Vane hadn't done it alone, the structural complexity was too precise for one man operating in real time. They'd already shown their method. They were thorough, they were patient, and they had someone inside. There's always a trail, he'd told her. He hoped she listened. He hoped her lawyers were good. He thought about calling his old handler because there was something about tonight that felt like it was pointing at something larger, but he set that thought aside. That wasn't his world anymore. He'd chosen that deliberately, loudly, at significant personal cost, and he wasn't going to unchoose it because a party on a rooftop had felt more familiar than it should have. He was a lifeguard. He had paperwork to file in the morning. He was asleep by 2:40. 3 things happened the following morning. The first, Sienna's lawyer, David Park, a compact, hyper-articulate man who billed at $900 an hour and was worth twice that, called at 7 a.m. to tell her that the preliminary review of board communication channels had surfaced 41 email threads that should not exist. He said the word significantly problematic 4 times in the first 2 minutes, which was David's version of "we have a catastrophic situation." "How bad?" she asked. She was on her second coffee, still in the clothes she'd worn last night, sitting at the desk in her home office where she'd been since 4 a.m. "Define bad," David said. "Garrett Cole's been forwarding security reports to a blind email address since April. The blind address routes to a server registered to a shell company in Delaware with no traceable beneficial owner, but the shell company made 3 wire transfers in the past 6 months to an operating account controlled by Vane Capital," she said. A pause. "You already knew." "I suspected the outline. I didn't have the specifics." She closed her eyes briefly. "How long has Garrett been on their payroll?" "At minimum, 6 months, possibly longer." 6 months. She thought about everything Garrett Cole had known in 6 months. Security procedures, personal schedules, the fact that she did her most important calls from her home office on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, the layout of the Aurelius's rooftop, the camera system. "Okay," she said. "What do I need to do?" David told her, and she wrote it down. And when the call ended, she sat in the quiet of her office and allowed herself 90 seconds of being completely overwhelmed before she put it back in the box and moved on to the next thing. That was a practice she'd developed consciously, the 90-second rule. You had 90 seconds to feel it, then you worked. The second thing that happened was that Gerald Whitmore called at 9:15, and she watched his name on the phone screen for 5 rings before she picked up. "Gerald." "Sienna." His voice had a different quality this morning, not the smooth authority of last night, something more careful. "I heard about what happened at the gala. I wanted to reach out and—" "Gerald, let me save us both some time." She kept her voice even. "I know about the resolution you drafted. David Park has seen the emails. So before you finish whatever you're calling to say, I need you to understand that if you and I can't reach an understanding today, your next conversation is going to be with federal investigators." A pause. "How would you like to proceed?" A very long silence. "I'd like to speak with my lawyer first," Gerald said. "That seems wise. Have them call David." She ended the call. She sat there for a moment. Her hands were not shaking. She noted that with something like satisfaction. The third thing that happened was that her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who was 24 and terrifyingly competent, forwarded her the hotel's morning incident report alongside a note that read, "The lifeguard who intervened last night has given full statements to police and is available for your legal team. His name is Caleb Ryder. I looked him up. He's not in any public records beyond his employment at Aurelius. No social media. Thought you should know that's either nothing or interesting." Sienna read that twice. Then she called the Aurelius Hotel and asked for the pool operations department. Caleb was running chlorine tests at 11 when his supervisor, a tired woman named Donna, who managed the Aurelius's entire aquatics program, appeared at the pool deck and told him the CEO of Holloway Group was on the phone and wanted to speak with him. He straightened up. "Did you tell her I'm working?" "Caleb?" Donna's expression suggested this was not the moment for that. "The CEO of Holloway Group is on my phone. For you. Because apparently last night you—" She made a gesture that encompassed the entirety of what she didn't have words for. "Just, please, take the call." He took the phone. "Mr. Ryder," Sienna said, "I hope I'm not interrupting something urgent." "Chemical test," he said. "It'll keep." "Right." A pause. He could hear her organizing her thoughts. "I'm calling for 2 reasons. First, my legal team would like to meet with you this week. They'll need a formal statement about the events of last night as part of the civil case we're building against Vane and Cole." "I already told the police everything." "This is parallel to the police investigation. Different jurisdiction, different purpose. It won't take more than an hour, and we can do it at a time that works around your schedule." "Okay," he said. "That's one reason." Another slight pause. "The second reason is that Holloway Group has security needs that are going to be significantly different from what they were 72 hours ago. I'm rebuilding that operation from scratch. I'd like to talk with you about a role in that process." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm a lifeguard," he said. "You are demonstrably not only a lifeguard." There was something in her voice that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite frustration, but was somewhere in the vicinity of both. I don't know exactly what you are, and you haven't been forthcoming about it, which I respect, but I'm offering to have a conversation, not making a formal offer, just a conversation. He looked out at the pool. The water was very blue and very still. A kid across the deck was leaning over the edge, looking at something in the water, probably a coin. He thought about the schedule he'd negotiated with the hotel. Tuesday and Thursday were school pickup days. He left at 2:30, no exceptions, and they'd agreed to that in writing on his first week because he'd made it the condition of accepting the job. He thought about Lily's school play in 3 weeks, the one Emma was helping direct because her drama teacher had put her in charge of the backstage crew, and she'd been talking about it non-stop for a month. He thought about the rooftop last night, and the 3 vectors and the cameras going dark, and the specific way Marcus Vane had held that document, casually, like the outcome was already determined. "What time?" he asked. "Thursday works for me," Sienna said. "Afternoon. I need to be done by 2. A slight pause. "That's fine. We'll start at noon." "Okay," he said. "Thursday at noon." He handed the phone back to Donna, who was trying very hard not to ask the questions that were clearly lined up behind her eyes. "Thanks," he said. "The chlorine in lane 3 is slightly low. I'll fix it before lunch." He walked back to the equipment locker. Behind him, Donna stared at the phone in her hand for a moment, then looked at the back of Caleb Ryder's retreating figure, and thought about how she'd worked in hotel pools for 17 years, and she had genuinely never had a week quite like this one. Well, the investigation was just beginning, and somewhere in a parking garage in Brickell, in a phone that had been confiscated by police but not yet fully analyzed, there were 43 text messages that were going to change everything anyone thought they knew about what had actually happened on that rooftop. And why? David Park's office was on the 31st floor of a building in Brickell that had been designed by someone who believed glass was a personality. The whole south wall was window, and on a clear Thursday the view stretched past the bay all the way to the Barrier Islands, which was the kind of view that cost money and was meant to remind you of that fact. Sienna arrived at 11:40, 20 minutes early, which was a habit she'd had since she was 7 years old, and which she'd learned from her father, who believed that the person who arrived last to any negotiation had already lost something. She sat in the reception area and drank bad coffee from a paper cup and answered 3 emails on her phone, and at exactly 5 past noon her assistant called to say that Caleb Ryder was downstairs. He arrived in the conference room 2 minutes later, and the first thing Sienna noticed was that he'd made an effort. Not a large one, but the shirt was pressed, and he'd shaved, and he held himself in the room with the careful posture of someone who had dressed for a context that wasn't entirely comfortable. He looked like a man attending a meeting he hadn't been sure how to prepare for, which she found, for reasons she didn't examine, slightly reassuring. David was already at the table with a yellow legal pad and 2 of his associates. He stood and shook Caleb's hand with the particular efficiency of a man who makes a living judging people quickly. "David Park, thank you for coming." "Caleb Ryder." He took the seat across from David and glanced at the legal pad without expression. "What do you need?" David needed, it turned out, quite a lot. For 45 minutes, he walked Caleb through the sequence of events on the rooftop with the systematic precision of someone building architecture out of testimony. "What time did you first observe Cole leaving the terrace? What was the exact sequence of camera deactivation as you witnessed it? Can you describe the positioning of the 2 associates in relation to Ms. Holloway at the moment you intervened? What were the specific words spoken by Marcus Vane?" Caleb answered everything. He answered in the same organized, unhurried way he'd spoken to the police. Dates, specifics, sequences. No elaboration unless asked. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't minimize. He said, "I don't know," twice, which David noted on the legal pad with a small mark. Sienna sat at the far end of the table and mostly listened. At one point, David asked, "Can you describe your specific qualifications that allowed you to intervene as effectively as you did?" And Caleb said, "I saw a situation that needed addressing, and I had the ability to address it." And David looked up from his pad and said, "That's not quite what I asked." And Caleb said, "I know." And there was a moment of quiet in which it became apparent to everyone in the room that this was the end of that particular avenue. David moved on, When the session ended at 1:50, David's associates gathered their notes and left. And David himself excused himself for a call. And for the first time since the rooftop, it was just Sienna and Caleb in the same room without 300 witnesses and two men on the floor between them. "You have somewhere to be," she said. He was already checking his watch. School pickups at 2:15. Traffic on the causeway is a problem after 2. "Then I won't keep you." She stood, and he stood, and she walked him toward the elevator. In the hallway, she said, "David thinks you're going to be one of the most valuable witnesses in the civil case." "I figured." "He also thinks you're military." Caleb pressed the elevator button. "David thinks a lot of things." "He's usually right." She stood next to him, not looking at him, looking at the elevator doors. "You don't have to tell me anything. I want you to know that. Whatever your background is, last Tuesday night was enough. You don't owe me a biography." The elevator arrived. He stepped in and turned around. "Navy," he said, when the doors were halfway closed. 8 years. I got out 4 years ago." The doors closed. She stood in the hallway for a moment, alone with the air conditioning hum and the muffled sounds of Brickell traffic 40 stories below. Then she went back to the conference room and called David. He said Navy, she told him. "SEAL," David said without hesitation. The way he moved, the way he talks, the way he doesn't answer questions he doesn't want to answer, that's specific training. He left 4 years ago. "People leave for reasons," David said. "The relevant question for our purposes is whether he's willing to be involved going forward." She pulled her notebook closer. "I haven't asked him yet." "Ask him," David said. "Because what I found in those emails this morning is worse than what I told you at 7 a.m., and the security structure you currently have, which is essentially me, you, and Priya, is not going to be sufficient for what's coming." She set down her pen. "How much worse?" A pause. "The resolution Gerald drafted isn't the only thing in play. There's a secondary document. It appears to be a restructuring proposal, designed to be filed with the SEC if the proxy agreement had gone through. The restructuring would have dissolved 3 of Holloway Group's primary subsidiaries and liquidated the assets within 90 days. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not a hostile takeover." "No," David said. "It's not. A hostile takeover assumes someone wants what you have. What this looks like is someone who wants to make sure what you have doesn't exist anymore." He paused. "Which raises a question about Marcus Vane's actual motivation that I don't have a good answer to yet." She sat with that. "Find the answer," she said. "Working on it. In the meantime, talk to the lifeguard." She looked at the legal pad on the table, covered in David's tight, precise handwriting. She thought about Caleb Ryder's face when the elevator doors were closing. The way he'd said it, Navy, like it was a footnote rather than a revelation. Like it was the least important part of what he was. She thought about a man who'd walked away from that and chosen a pool deck and a school pickup at 2:15 and a pull-out couch in Hialeah. She had a company to save and a board that was compromised and a conspiracy that was apparently larger than she'd understood 12 hours ago. She had David Park and her own considerable intelligence and a family name that carried weight in Miami financial circles. Those were the resources she had. And then there was the quiet man who'd appeared out of nowhere on a rooftop and taken apart a coordinated attack in 4 seconds and then gone home to check on his kids. She closed the notebook and started making calls. The Thursday afternoon traffic on the causeway was, as predicted, a problem. Caleb sat in it with the radio on low and thought about the conference room and David Park's legal pad and the way Sienna Holloway moved through a room full of lawyers, not performing authority, just exercising it, the way you exercise a muscle you've been using your whole life. He also thought about what he'd seen on David's legal pad from across the table. He hadn't been trying to read it, but the upside-down text had included 2 words he recognized: shell company and liquidation. And the mental picture those words assembled, combined with what he'd observed on the rooftop and what he knew about how coordinated financial attacks worked, was assembling itself into a shape he didn't entirely like. He picked up Emma and Lily at 2:20, which was 5 minutes late, and cost him a look from Emma that said she'd noticed. And they stopped for groceries on the way home because there was nothing in the refrigerator except leftover rice and the particular optimism of a half-empty jar of peanut butter. In the grocery store, Lily held his hand and narrated everything she saw with the stream of consciousness thoroughness of a 5-year-old who hadn't yet learned that not every observation needed to be spoken aloud. Emma walked slightly ahead with her hands in her hoodie pocket, which was her resting position for most situations. "Dad," Emma said, in the cereal aisle. "Yeah." "Something happened at your work. Priya from Mrs. Garcia's mom group was talking about it at school pickup. She said there was a thing at a party." He picked up a box of cereal and looked at the back. "There was a situation at the hotel Tuesday night. It's handled." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that's handled." Emma stopped walking and looked at him. She had Rachel's eyes, which was the thing about Emma that still sometimes caught him off guard, the way looking at her could still suddenly become looking at someone else for a half second. "Were you in it?" He put the cereal in the cart. "I was there, it's fine, nobody got hurt. Priya's mom said a lifeguard took down 2 security guys. Priya's mom talks a lot." A pause. Emma fell back into step beside him. "Was it you?" He looked at her sideways. She was 12 and she had the focused, patient look of someone who'd learned that waiting was more effective than pressing. She'd learned that from him, probably. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. "Yeah," he said. "It was me." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Are you okay?" "I'm good." "Okay." She picked up a box of her preferred granola bars and put it in the cart. "Can we get the good pasta, or are we doing the store brand again?" Store brand. That's what I thought. They moved on through the store, and he thought about how Emma had asked, "Are you okay?" before she'd asked anything else, and he thought that maybe he was doing something right. At home, while Lily orchestrated an elaborate drama involving 3 stuffed animals and a plastic dinosaur on the kitchen floor, and while Emma sat at the table working through homework with the methodical focus she applied to things she didn't want to do, Caleb made dinner and tried to think through what David Park's legal pad had been telling him. Shell companies and liquidation weren't the vocabulary of a straightforward hostile takeover. Hostile takeovers were about acquisition. You wanted the thing, you took the thing, you ran the thing. What David's notes suggested was something more like demolition. Someone who wanted Holloway Group not to exist. The question was why. He turned the pasta water on and thought about Marcus Vane. He'd looked him up after work Tuesday, through public sources. Vane Capital Partners, founded 2009, based out of New York with an office in Miami, focused on financial sector investments and what the company's own website called strategic restructuring opportunities, which was the language that money used when it was discussing things that weren't quite legal but weren't technically illegal either. The company's recent history was a series of acquisitions of mid-sized financial services firms, followed by restructurings, followed by asset sales. The pattern was consistent. Vane didn't build things. Vane took things apart. So the question was what Holloway Group had that was worth taking apart. He was still turning that question over when his phone rang. Unknown number, Miami area code. He almost didn't pick up, but something made him. "Ryder," he said. A pause. Then a voice he didn't recognize. Male, careful, not young. "Mr. Ryder, my name is Leonard Marsh. You don't know me. My wife Linda was at the Aurelius Gala Tuesday night. She was one of the witnesses." Caleb leaned against the counter. "I remember her. She's a federal prosecutor. Former, technically. She retired last year." Another pause. "She called me from the gala while everything was still happening. She's been involved in financial crimes work for 22 years, Mr. Ryder, and she said watching you work was the most interesting thing she'd seen in a long time." A short, dry sound that might have been a laugh. "She also said she thought you'd served." "But did she? She has good instincts." A pause. "I'm calling because I've seen the news coverage of what happened Tuesday, and I've seen the name Marcus Vane, and I want to tell you something that I think the people around Sienna Holloway need to know." Caleb turned the burner down. "I'm listening." "I'm a retired Treasury Department investigator," Marsh said. "Financial Crimes Division, 30 years. I've been retired for 2 years and I have no official standing in any of this. I want to be clear about that up front." Another pause. "But Marcus Vane is a name I know, not from public records, from an investigation that was closed 18 months ago. Closed, not concluded. There's a difference." Caleb was very still. Emma looked up from her homework briefly, and he made a face that said, "It's fine. Keep going. And she looked back down. Why was it closed? He asked. Lack of cooperating witnesses. The case involved an allegation that Vane Capital Partners was acting as a front for the movement of funds connected to a group of offshore interests I'm not going to name on an unsecured call. Marsh's voice was even, deliberate. The allegation was that Vane wasn't making acquisitions for his own benefit. He was doing it for someone else's. And when the targets were fully acquired and liquidated, the asset proceeds moved through a series of shell accounts before reaching their actual destination. Caleb let that settle. Money laundering. At a minimum. A pause. The thing about Holloway Group, Mr. Ryder, is that it has 3 subsidiaries that I suspect are very interesting to whoever is actually directing Vane's acquisitions. Not because of what those subsidiaries do, but because of the regulatory licenses they hold. Specifically, one of them holds a broker-dealer license that hasn't been used actively in about 2 years but is still valid. That license, in the right structure, would allow someone to move very large sums through very legitimate-looking channels. Caleb looked at the window above the sink, at the darkening sky outside. You're saying this isn't about the company. It's about what the company can be used for. I'm saying that's what the evidence pointed toward before the case was closed. Marsh paused again. I'm also saying that whoever Sienna Holloway has, advising her needs to understand that if Vane is still operating on behalf of the same interests, Tuesday night was not the end of this. It was the beginning of a different phase. The pasta water was boiling. Caleb turned off the burner. Why are you calling me? He asked. You don't know me. Linda described you very specifically. A slight pause that might have been amusement. She said you were the only person on that rooftop who understood what was actually happening, and that she trusted your judgment based on about 40 minutes of observation, which is the highest compliment she gives. That's a lot of faith to put in a lifeguard. Yes, Marsh said. It is. Another pause. Will you pass this on to whoever needs to hear it? I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. A pause. My number is attached to this call. You can reach me if there's anything specific you need to know that's a matter of public record. Beyond that, I've said what I can. I understand. Good luck, Mr. Ryder. The call ended. Caleb stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the dead screen, then at the boiling water he'd turned off, then at Emma, who was watching him with the particular attention she gave things she'd decided she wasn't going to ask about directly. Everything okay? She said. Yeah. He turned the burner back on. Pasta in 10 minutes. Dad. M. She looked at him. He looked at her. She had the specific expression she got when she'd decided that pressing wasn't going to produce results and had filed the question for later. Fine, she said, and went back to her homework. He made dinner and they ate at the kitchen table, which was also the homework table and the project table, and the table where Emma had told him last year that she wanted to try out for the school play, which had been the first thing she'd wanted in a long time, and he'd said yes before she finished the sentence, which was also the thing he did when it mattered. After dinner, after Lily was in bed and Emma was in her room with the curtain door closed, he sat on the pull-out couch with his phone and thought for a long time. Then he called Sienna Holloway. She picked up on the second ring. Ryder, you said to call if I thought of anything. I did. A pause. He could hear background sounds. She was in her home office, probably. Papers, low music. What did you think of? I got a call tonight from a retired Treasury Department investigator named Leonard Marsh. His wife was at the gala. He laid it out for her the same way he'd given his witness statement, in order, without embellishment. The investigation that had been closed, the broker-dealer license, the movement of funds, the suggestion that Vane was operating on behalf of someone else. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. That's the part that doesn't fit, she said finally. I've been trying to understand what Vane gains from dismantling the company rather than running it. He's a businessman, not a vandal. There has to be a return. There is, just not the one you'd expect. The broker-dealer license. Her voice was different now. Not colder, but tighter, the quality of someone assembling a picture. My father acquired it through the purchase of a small clearinghouse in 2019. We've kept it current, but it's not been operationally active. I never considered it as a target. A pause. Who's directing Vane? Marsh didn't say on an unsecured call, but he offered to speak more specifically about public record information if someone asked the right questions. David needs to talk to him. That's what I thought. Another pause. You could have texted this, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't entirely about the business of it, just slightly. A degree or two off center from professional. Could have, he said. Seemed like something you should hear directly. She was quiet for a moment in a way that felt different from the other pauses in the conversation. He heard her set something down on her desk. Can I ask you something? She said. You can try. Why are you still involved in this? You gave your statement. You're not on the legal team. This isn't your problem. He thought about that. He thought about the rooftop and the 3 vectors and the cameras going dark, and about Leonard Marsh saying Tuesday night was not the end of this. He thought about the broker-dealer license and the shell companies and the offshore interests Marsh hadn't named. It's not that simple a question, he said. Most questions aren't. A pause. But try. He looked at the ceiling. The apartment was very quiet now, the specific late-night quiet that he'd come to associate with the hour after the kids were in bed, when the day finally settled. Because whoever put this together didn't do it for Tuesday night, he said. They did it for something larger. And Tuesday night failing doesn't stop them. It just changes their timeline. He paused. And because you're still in the middle of it, and you don't have anyone on your team who's thinking about the next move instead of the last one. She didn't say anything immediately. That's honest, she said finally. You asked. I did. A pause. What would you do if you were thinking about the next move? I'd find out who Marsh couldn't name on an unsecured call, he said. Because if Vane's a front, then Vane getting arrested doesn't end this. It just inconveniences whoever's actually running the play. He paused. And I'd be careful who knows I'm asking. Including David? He thought about that. David's clean, but his firm has 40 lawyers, and not all of them are going to be careful about what they say over drinks. A short silence. You're saying my own legal team might be a vulnerability. I'm saying compartmentalize. Only David knows everything. His associates know what they need for their specific parts. I already do that. I know. I watched you in the conference room. He paused. I'm saying do it more. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. You watched me. I watch rooms, he said. Old habit. You've said that before. It keeps being true. Another pause, and this one was softer around the edges than the previous ones. He noticed that and didn't follow it. I'm going to call David tonight, she said, and I'm going to ask him to reach out to Leonard Marsh in the morning. A pause. And I want to have another conversation with you this week. Not for legal testimony, just to think through what you said about the next move. Okay? Friday works for me. I can come to you if that's easier. I work Friday morning. I'm done at noon. Noon, then. Is there somewhere near the hotel that isn't the hotel? He thought about it. There's a place on the bay. Cubano sandwiches, terrible coffee, plastic chairs. Nobody who's at your board meetings is going to be there. That sounds perfect, she said, and she meant it, and that surprised him slightly. He said goodnight and set the phone down on the couch beside him and sat in the quiet for a while. Outside, a car went by on the street below, bass-heavy music briefly loud and then gone. The refrigerator made its small mechanical sound. Somewhere in the back of the apartment, Lily turned over in her sleep. He thought about what Marsh had said. A different phase. He thought about broker-dealer licenses and shell accounts, and the particular kind of invisible that money could make itself when it needed to travel. He'd spent 8 years learning how threats moved through systems, how the visible action was almost never the actual action, how the thing that was happening was always pointing at something else, something larger, something that wouldn't be visible until it was either stopped or completed. He was out of that life. He'd chosen to be out of it, deliberately, with both hands, and he didn't regret it. But the thing about the way your brain got wired was that you didn't unwire it just by leaving. The pattern recognition didn't stop. The threat assessment didn't stop. You just applied it to smaller things, pool chemistry, school pickup logistics, the question of whether the guy in the lobby was waiting for someone or casing the place. He'd applied it to a rooftop on a Tuesday night, and now he was sitting on a pull-out couch at 11 p.m., being pulled back toward exactly the kind of gravity he'd spent 4 years moving away from. He should stay out of it. Give his testimony, let the lawyers and investigators handle the rest. Go back to the pool and the chemical tests and the school pickups. That was the smart move. That was the safe move for his kids, who needed their father present and uncomplicated and not getting involved in whatever Marcus Vane was actually part of. He lay down on the couch and looked at the ceiling. He stayed out of it for about 45 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and sent a text to a number he hadn't contacted in over 2 years. A number he hadn't deleted because he'd known, in some quiet part of himself, that there might come a day when he'd need it. It's Ryder. I need background on a name. Offshore, financial, possible intelligence adjacent. Not official, just context. He set the phone face down on the cushion beside him. 3 minutes later it buzzed. Figured I'd hear from you eventually. Send the name. He picked up the phone. He thought about Sienna Holloway standing barefoot on a rooftop, the city sprawled below her, calling her lawyer at 1 a.m. He thought about 300 people who hadn't moved. He thought about Marsh saying Tuesday was the beginning of a different phase. He typed, Marcus Vane, Vane Capital Partners, New York/Miami. He sent it and set the phone down and closed his eyes and didn't sleep for a long time. The name came back in under 6 hours. Caleb was on his second cup of coffee Friday morning, standing at the pool station watching a retired couple do slow laps in lane 2, when his phone buzzed with a message from the number he hadn't contacted in 2 years. Vane is confirmed intermediary. Principal is a holding structure registered in Luxembourg, beneficial ownership obscured through 3 layers. The structure has known connections to a Caucasus-based capital group the Treasury has been watching since 2021. Your Treasury guy Marsh was right. The case got closed because the primary cooperating witness withdrew. Withdrew, meaning disappeared. Not dead, just gone. Left the country with his family 2 weeks before scheduled testimony. Draw your own conclusions. There's more, but not in text. Call me when kids are at school. Caleb read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the equipment cart and watched the retired couple make their slow turn at the far wall and push back the other direction. The woman's stroke was patient and even. The man kept drifting left, correcting, drifting again. He thought about the word disappeared. The specific way his contact had used it, not dead, just gone, which in the world they'd both come from, was sometimes a distinction without a meaningful difference, because a man who left the country with his family 2 weeks before testifying had been made to understand something in a language that didn't need words. He waited until 8:15, when Emma and Lily were both at school and the morning rush at the pool had thinned, and then he called. His contact's name was Darius Webb. They'd served together for 3 years in a context that Caleb didn't describe to people, and Darius didn't either. Darius had stayed in longer, moved into a different kind of work, and was currently doing something in the private sector that was vague enough in its description that Caleb had stopped asking for details. "It's early," Darius said when he picked up. "You're already awake." "I'm always already awake." "That's the problem." A pause, the sound of something being set down. "So, Marcus Vane, talk to me." Vane's been an intermediary for the Luxembourg structure for at least 4 years. Maybe longer. The acquisitions he does, the ones that look like standard hostile plays, they're targeted, they're not random. Someone upstream identifies a target based on specific regulatory or licensing criteria. Vane moves on the company. Asset liquidation happens, and the proceed flow disappears into a structure that would take a team of forensic accountants 6 months to trace. A pause. The Holloway Group acquisition wasn't about the company. You figured that already. The broker-dealer license. More specifically, what you can do with a broker-dealer license if you also control the compliance oversight within the company. There's a way to structure it so that large transfers look like standard settlement activity. It's the kind of thing that takes maybe 8 months to set up properly before anyone at the SEC level even thinks to look. Darius paused. "We're talking about 9 figures minimum, Caleb. This isn't a small operation." 9 figures. Caleb leaned against the pool station railing and watched the water. Who's the Luxembourg structure ultimately connected to? That's where it gets complicated and also where I have to be careful about what I say. The short version is, it's not a simple criminal organization. It's more like a network of connected interests that spans about 4 countries. And some of those interests have enough political cover in their home jurisdictions that going after them directly is difficult, which is why the Treasury case getting killed wasn't an accident. Someone made a call. Someone with enough pull to close a federal investigation. Someone with enough reach to make a witness understand that the right move was a new life in a country without an extradition treaty. A pause. I'm not saying the principle here is untouchable. I'm saying touching them requires understanding exactly what you're dealing with, because these are people who plan for interference. They've planned for Tuesday night already. Vane getting arrested, Cole getting arrested, that's acceptable losses to them. They move to the next approach. Caleb thought about what he'd said to Sienna on the phone. Tuesday night was the beginning of a different phase. He hadn't known then how literally true that was. What's the next approach look like? He asked. I don't know specifically, but the pattern with previous targets suggests it comes from a different direction. Legal, regulatory, something that uses the system instead of working around it. They burn their direct play. Next move is subtler. A pause. Your CEO needs to understand that the board situation is going to get messier before it gets cleaner. If they can't get the company through direct pressure, they'll try to destabilize it from inside the governance structure. Create enough internal conflict that the board votes to restructure on their own, which then creates a window. Gerald Whitmore. If Whitmore was already in communication with Vane, there are probably others on that board who received similar conversations. Maybe not formal coordination. Maybe just suggestions about the company's direction, about the CEO's competence. A pause. You know how this works. You don't need to own the board. You just need to create enough doubt that the board owns itself into the outcome you want. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Through the window of the pool enclosure, he could see the bay, flat and silver gray in the morning light. What do you need from me? Darius asked. Nothing right now. I needed to understand the shape of it. Caleb. A pause. You're not just the lifeguard in this anymore. I was never just the lifeguard. No, Darius said, but you were trying to be. I respected that. Another pause. Be careful what you step back into. You've got kids. I know what I've got. I know you do. As a pause that held more in it than the words around it. Call me if you need more. And Caleb, whatever you do, don't let the CEO go public with what she knows about the Luxembourg connection. Not yet. If the principal's here she has that information, the calculus changes in ways that get dangerous fast. Understood. Good luck. The line went dead. Caleb stood at the pool station for a long time, watching the water, watching the retired man drift left and correct and drift again. The same mistake on every lap, patient and uncorrectable. By 11:30, he'd clocked out, changed out of the uniform, and was walking the 3 blocks to the place on the bay he'd described to Sienna, a lunch counter called Marta's that had been in the same location since 1987, run by a woman named Marta who was now in her 70s and whose opinion of her own coffee was considerably higher than its objective quality warranted. He got there early and took the table in the back corner, the one with sight lines to both the entrance and the service exit, and ordered coffee he didn't plan to drink, and waited. Sienna arrived 4 minutes past noon in a car she'd driven herself, not a car service, which told him she'd thought about the conversation she was about to have and decided it wasn't one she wanted a driver to overhear. She was dressed differently than she'd been in the conference room. Dark jeans, a light blazer, hair down instead of up. She looked like a person more than a CEO, which he suspected she'd also calculated. She slid into the seat across from him, looked at the coffee he hadn't touched, and said, "Is it as bad as it looks?" "Worse." He pushed it toward her. "I got a Cubano. You want one?" "Yes." She looked around the place. The plastic chairs, the handwritten menu on the board above the counter, the framed photos of the original Martas that had been in the neighborhood before the whole waterfront got rebuilt into something expensive. "This is great. Nobody from your board meetings is ever going to walk in here." "That's exactly what I need today." She looked back at him. "Tell me what you have." He laid it out the same way he'd given it to David, in order, without gaps, without softening. The Luxembourg structure, the 4-country network, the broker-dealer license and what it could be used for, the Treasury investigation, and the witness who disappeared with his family. The nine-figure sum that made all of this worthwhile to people who had the reach to close federal cases. Sienna listened without interrupting, which he'd noticed was something she was genuinely capable of doing, which wasn't as common as people thought. She had both hands around the coffee cup he'd pushed across to her, not drinking it, just holding it. Her face was still and attentive and gave very little away. When he finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds. "The witness who disappeared?" she said. "Does your contact know where he is?" "No, or if he does, he didn't say. Because if he's still alive and reachable, his testimony is the piece that closed the Treasury case when it went missing." "Yeah." He nodded. "But finding him is a different operation than what you currently have the capacity for. David has contacts in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. David's firm is probably fine, but the moment this goes formally into a federal process, the principals learn about it. They've demonstrated they have enough reach to get information out of federal investigations. You'd be showing your hand before you have the full picture." She processed that. "So what's the move?" He reached for the coffee she wasn't drinking and took a sip out of old habit and then remembered why he'd decided not to drink it. He set it back down. "Right now, you need two things simultaneously, and they can't touch each other. One is the legal and regulatory case, the civil filing, the criminal referrals for Vane and Cole, the SEC documentation on the share accumulation. That goes through David, and it goes through proper channels, and it builds the record that protects your position in the company." She nodded. "The other thing you need is the picture that makes the first thing make sense. Who the Luxembourg structure connects to. Why Holloway Group specifically. Whether there are other board members who've been approached." He paused. "That doesn't go through David. That goes through a much smaller circle." She looked at him across the table. "How small?" "You. Me. Whoever I need to bring in on specific questions, and I'll tell you before I do." She was quiet for a moment. "You're describing a parallel investigation." "I'm describing trying to understand what you're actually dealing with before you engage it publicly and give it time to adapt." She looked at him steadily. This was the thing about Sienna Holloway. She didn't flinch from information that was unpleasant. She absorbed it and then worked with it. And in the meantime, they make their next move. They make their next move whatever you do. The question is whether you understand what it is before or after it lands. The Cubanos arrived, brought by a teenage kid who was clearly Marta's grandson and who set them down with the particular care of someone who'd been told to be careful with the guests. Sienna looked at the sandwich in front of her like she was briefly surprised by it. They ate in silence for a minute. Outside, a pelican landed on the dock railing and surveyed the water with the authority of something that owned the place. "Tell me about the board," Caleb said. She chewed, swallowed, wiped her hands on the paper napkin. 9 seats. My father held the chair until his stroke. He still technically holds it, but he hasn't been functional in 11 months. I have operational control, but not the chair. That's a vulnerability I've been trying to close through the Meridian deal, which would have brought in 2 new board seats aligned with my direction. A pause. Gerald Whitmore has been a board member for 19 years. He was my father's ally, and then he stopped being useful in that role and started being something else. When did the shift happen? She thought about it. About 18 months ago, maybe a little less, he started voting differently. Started asking different questions in meetings. Not hostile exactly, just realigned. She looked at the table. I thought it was about the succession. He'd always assumed my father would have a son, and that the son would run the company. And then there was me. And Gerald is 70 years old, and some people that age have beliefs they don't update. And now you think it's something else. Now I think someone talked to him, and it wasn't about whether he respected my competence. It was about a more concrete motivation. A pause. David found email threads. They're not explicit. Nobody says anything that could be entered into evidence on its own, but the pattern is there. Gerald has been in communication with a law firm that David traced back to a New York holding company, which traces back to something in Europe. She looked at him. You already knew. I figured the pattern. Same structure, different approach point. He set down the sandwich. They work through multiple contact nodes so the principals stay clean. Gerald might not even know who he's ultimately working for. He might just know that someone is offering him a financial arrangement and a certain kind of protection for his own position if the restructuring goes through. What kind of protection? Whatever he's worried about. People like Gerald Whitmore have been doing business for 40 years. There are usually things they'd prefer not to have examined closely. He paused. I'm not saying that's definitely the leverage. I'm saying it's the kind of thing worth understanding. She nodded slowly. Okay. Who else on the board might be in the same position? Who's the most recently appointed? Elaine Torres. She came on 8 months ago through a nominating process that Gerald chaired. A pause. She's been mostly quiet in meetings. Votes with the majority on procedural things. Abstains on the bigger questions. I haven't been able to read her. New appointment, Gerald controlled the process. She's been carefully neutral. Caleb looked out at the bay. She might be another contact point, or she might just be someone who's trying to survive the middle of a situation she didn't fully understand when she took the seat. He looked back at Sienna. Don't assume hostile, but keep track of what she knows and when she learns it. You think like this naturally, Sienna said. It wasn't quite an accusation, more like an observation that was still working out what it meant. It's how I was trained to think. The Navy. The specific part of the Navy that I was in. He paused, which required a particular way of looking at situations. Threat mapping, actor analysis, understanding the whole structure before engaging any individual node. A pause. I don't love that I still think this way, but here we are. She looked at him for a moment. Why do you not love it? He considered how to answer that. Because when you think that way about everything, you stop being able to just be in a room. You're always watching the doors. You're always running the numbers. You're always asking, what's the play? He picked up his coffee, remembered, set it down. It's useful in situations like this. In most situations, it just makes you somebody who can't sit through a school play without checking the exits twice. She was quiet for a moment. Is that what you did? At the school play? There was an incident earlier this year where Emma's drama teacher had her running the backstage crew. The play was about... He stopped. He hadn't meant to start that sentence. Yeah, he said. I checked the exits. Something in her face shifted, just slightly. Not pity, which he wouldn't have wanted. Something quieter than that. Emma's the 12-year-old. Yeah. And Lily is 5. Lily staged a coup last week involving a plastic dinosaur and 3 stuffed animals. I'm still not sure who won. She smiled at that. A real one. The kind that arrived before she decided whether she meant to show it. Then she looked back at the table. Your wife, she said carefully. You don't have to... Rachel, he said. Her name was Rachel. She died 4 years ago. Aneurysm. There were no signs. A pause. She was 31. Sienna was quiet. I got out 3 weeks after her funeral, he said, which maybe wasn't the most rational timeline, but it was the one that made sense at the time. Emma was 8 and Lily was 14 months, and I needed to be home, consistently. Not deployed, not available in ways that required asterisks. He paused. Rachel always said the Navy could have me, or she could have me but not both at the same time, and she was right. And she was also gone, and Emma and Lily still needed someone to be there all the time. A pause. So I went home, and ended up at the Aurelius, after a few other things that didn't work. He shrugged slightly. Hotel pool lifeguard is actually a pretty good job for a single parent. The schedule has flexibility. The work doesn't follow you home, and the stakes are... He paused. Usually the stakes are just pool chemistry. Until Tuesday. Until Tuesday. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. Then she looked up. My father had a stroke before I turned 30. My mother left when I was 12. The company has been... It's been the thing that's always been there. A pause. I know that sounds like something a person who needs to get out more would say. It sounds like someone who put everything into the one thing that couldn't leave. She looked at him. The afternoon light off the bay was coming through the window at a low angle, and she looked for a moment like someone who had briefly stopped performing the version of herself the room required. Just a person, sitting at a plastic table, eating a Cubano sandwich, with the weight of something very large sitting on her shoulders. We should probably get back to the board situation, she said. Probably, he agreed. But neither of them moved immediately, and the pelican on the dock railing picked something off the water, and the lunch counter hummed around them, and outside the bay was silver and flat under the midday sun. Then Sienna's phone rang. She looked at the screen and her expression changed. "It's Priya," she said. Priya was her assistant. She answered. Caleb watched her face as she listened. He watched the specific sequence of reactions. First attention, then sharpening, then the stillness that she used as a container for things she didn't want visible. "When?" she said. A pause. "Who filed it?" Another pause. "Don't confirm or deny anything to anyone until David calls you. I'll be in the office in 40 minutes. She ended the call and set the phone on the table. "What happened?" Caleb asked. She looked at him. "Someone filed a complaint with the SEC this morning, alleging that Holloway Group's Q3 earnings disclosure was materially misleading." A pause. "The complaint includes internal financial documents that are confidential, documents that only someone with access to our internal reporting system would have." He absorbed that. "The next move," he said. "It's regulatory now, not physical, not a rooftop confrontation. They're using the process." Her jaw was tight. "If the SEC opens a formal inquiry, the board has grounds to freeze my operational authority pending the outcome. It could take months, and in the meantime, the company is in limbo and the board can act without you." He nodded slowly. "Who has access to those internal financial documents?" "Senior finance team, the board, my office." A pause. "Garrett Cole had administrative access as head of security." She stopped. "He's in custody, but his access credentials may not have been revoked quickly enough." Caleb was already thinking through it. "Or he passed them to someone before he was arrested." He looked at her. "You need to get to David right now. Not in 40 minutes, right now." He pushed back from the table and stood. "I'll drive you." She looked up at him. "You don't have to." "My next commitment is school pickup at 2:15. I have time." He picked up the check off the table. "Come on." She gathered her jacket and stood, and he went to the counter and paid Marta's grandson and walked outside into the blinding Miami noon, and Sienna was behind him, and for the first time since the rooftop, she was the one following instead of leading, and she noticed that, and she let it be. In the car, his car, a 2019 Civic with a school parking pass on the visor and a small stuffed dinosaur on the dashboard that Lily had installed 2 months ago and that he'd never removed. She was on the phone with David before they cleared the parking lot. She laid out the SEC filing in under 2 minutes, gave him the specifics, answered his questions with the precision of someone who knew what information mattered. He watched her from the corner of his eye while he drove and thought about how different she was in this context than she'd been on the rooftop. There, she'd been trapped, controlled, working within the options other people had given her. Here, she was in motion, and in motion, she was formidable. David, on the phone, was using the word problematic again. "David," she said, "I need solutions, not characterizations." A pause. More talking. "Is there a process to challenge the standing of the complaint before the inquiry opens formally?" A pause. "Then start it, today." A pause. "I know it's Friday. Tell them to answer their phones." She ended the call. She stared through the windshield for a moment. The Miami afternoon was the particular shade of bright that made everything look slightly overexposed. "The internal documents," Caleb said. "Is there any possibility they were taken before Tuesday, before Garrett was arrested?" "Possible. Probable, actually. If they'd been planning the next phase since Tuesday, they had the documents ready." She paused. "Which means they moved fast. Or they had it ready in advance, contingency plan. If the rooftop play worked, they didn't need it. When it didn't, they filed it within 3 days." She turned to look at him. "They planned for failure." "Good operations always do." He stopped at a light. "The question is whether they have a third option, a contingency for the contingency." She was quiet for a moment. "How do you plan for something like that?" He thought about it. "You assume they have one, and you make sure that when it lands, you already understand the architecture it's part of, so you're not starting from zero each time." He glanced at her. "Which is what we were talking about at lunch. Before Priya called." "Before Priya called." He turned onto the main arterial heading toward Brickell. The Luxembourg structure, the board contacts, the pattern of approach. You need that picture complete before they use the third option, because the third option is probably the one they think will actually work. She was looking straight ahead. What do you think the third option is? He took a moment. I think it's your father, he said. She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. Your father technically still holds the board chair. His medical situation has been managed privately, but it's known in financial circles that he's been incapacitated for almost a year. If the right person were to file a guardianship petition or a motion related to his estate and the disposition of his shares, he paused. His shares plus Gerald's alignment gives them a path that doesn't require your compliance at all. The silence that followed was different from the other silences in the car. He felt the weight of it. My father, she said quietly. Not a question, just the word sitting there. I could be wrong, he said. It's a read, not a certainty. She was quiet for a long moment. He's in a care facility in Coral Gables. He has good days and bad days. He knows who I am when I visit. She stopped. He can't hold a pen anymore. Caleb said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be insufficient. He pulled up in front of David Park's building, and she sat in the car for a second longer than she needed to, which was the 1 second she allowed herself. And then she reached for the door handle. Caleb, she said. Yeah. The way you think, the threat mapping, the pattern reading, the never being able to just sit in a room. She paused. It's keeping me ahead of something that would have buried me by now without it. She looked at him. I don't think you should be ashamed of it. He didn't say anything. I'll call you tonight, she said, and got out of the car and walked into the building without looking back. And he sat in the Civic with the stuffed dinosaur on the dashboard and the school parking pass on the visor and watched her go. At 2:15, he was in the school pickup line, which was exactly where he needed to be. Lily came out first, running, which she did everywhere as a matter of principle, and hit the car door at full speed. Emma emerged 30 seconds later, more measured, and got in the back seat with the specific exhaustion of a 12-year-old who had feelings about Fridays. How was school? He asked. Fine, Emma said. Daddy, Lily said. There was a caterpillar on the playground, and it was green, and Tyler said it was poisonous, but I looked at it and it was not poisonous. How'd you know it wasn't poisonous? Because it was small. This logic was apparently airtight. Good assessment, he said. He pulled out of the pickup line and into traffic, and Emma was quiet in the back seat, and Lily was narrating the ongoing diplomatic situation between the stuffed animals and the plastic dinosaur, and the afternoon stretched out ahead of them, homework and dinner and bath time, and the small negotiations of putting people to bed. And he was in it, fully, the way he needed to be. His phone sat silent in the cup holder. He thought briefly about the third option he'd described to Sienna. He thought about a man in a care facility in Coral Gables with good days and bad days, who knew who his daughter was when she visited. He thought about people who could look at that and see a leverage point. Then he put it in the box because he was in the pickup line and Lily was explaining caterpillar forensics and Emma was tired and needed dinner. The box would keep until tonight. It always did. Sienna called at 9:47 that night, which was later than he'd expected. He was on the pull-out couch with the lamp on low, reading nothing in particular, when the phone lit up. He picked up before the second ring. Tell me it's not the father, she said. No greeting, just that. He sat up. What happened? David got a call 40 minutes ago from an attorney named Philip Crane. Crane represents a woman named Judith Holloway. A pause. That's my father's sister, my aunt. She lives in Scottsdale. I've seen her maybe 4 times in the last decade. We are not close. Another pause, shorter. She's filing for legal guardianship of my father next week. The petition, if granted, would give her control over his estate, including his Holloway Group shares. Caleb closed his eyes for half a second. How much of the company does your father hold personally? 19%. Combined with Gerald's 8 and the shares Vane accumulated, that would give the controlling bloc everything they need to reshape the board without my agreement. Her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something that had been compressed very tightly. I haven't spoken to my aunt since my father's birthday 18 months ago. She sent a card. That was the last contact. A pause. And now she has a lawyer calling David at 8 in the evening on a Friday. Did David know Crane? He knew of him. Corporate and estate attorney, New York practice, works almost exclusively with high net worth clients. A pause. David pulled his firm's client list from public filings. Crane represented a Delaware holding company in a 2022 merger dispute. The Delaware company is one of the shells that traces back to the Luxembourg structure. The thread connecting everything pulled tighter. Caleb sat in the quiet of the apartment and let that land properly. Your aunt, he said carefully. Is there any chance she's doing this independently, that she has her own concerns about your father's care? A long pause. The kind that meant she'd already considered it, and the answer was complicated. She and my father had a difficult relationship for most of their adult lives. There were disputes about their parents' estate when my grandfather died. They were functional at best. She never visited the care facility, not once in 11 months. Another pause. So, do I think she woke up last week with a sincere concern for her brother's welfare? No, I don't. Okay. Someone got to her. Someone offered her something. Her voice dropped slightly. I don't know if she understands what she's actually part of, or if she just saw an opportunity and took it. Either way, it doesn't matter. The petition gets filed, the court process takes months, my father's shares are frozen during the dispute, and we're back to a board where I can't hold the vote. Can you contest the guardianship? David says yes, but it's expensive and slow and creates exactly the kind of public uncertainty that helps their SEC complaint. A pause. Two moves at once. Regulatory pressure from the SEC filing, governance pressure from the guardianship petition. Both of them individually manageable. Together they create a window. What's the timeline on the SEC complaint? David bought us time with a procedural challenge. Maybe 3 weeks before a formal inquiry opens. The guardianship filing hits the court docket Monday. She paused. We have maybe 2 weeks where both things are still contestable before they start compounding each other. 2 weeks. Caleb thought about what Darius had said about the witness who'd disappeared, about the case that had been closed, about the reach that could make a federal investigation go quiet. I need to make a call tomorrow morning, he said. Give me until 10. What kind of call? The kind that might tell us who your aunt talked to and what they offered her. If we can show the guardianship petition was initiated by a compromised party with a financial interest in the outcome, it changes the court's view of her standing. She was quiet for a moment. That's a different kind of work than pool chemistry. Yeah, Caleb. A pause. Are you sure you want to keep being in this? He thought about Darius's voice on the phone. You've got kids. He thought about the box he put things in at school pickup and took back out after bedtime. He thought about the way Sienna had said, it's keeping me ahead of something that would have buried me, and hadn't looked away from him when she said it. I'll call you at 10, he said. She didn't push. Okay, 10. He sat on the couch after the call ended and didn't sleep for a long time. The apartment settled around him. The refrigerator's small sounds, the distant traffic, the specific breathing quiet of his kids asleep. He thought about Rachel, which he tried not to do late at night because it led places that weren't useful. But sometimes the thought came anyway, the way weather comes, without asking permission. Rachel would have had opinions about all of this. She'd been a person with sharp opinions about most things, which had been one of the things he'd loved about her, and also one of the things that had made the silence of the apartment afterwards so complete it was almost physical. She would have looked at the situation and said something direct and slightly inconvenient that was also exactly right. He thought she probably would have liked Sienna Holloway. And then he set that thought down gently and tried to sleep. In the morning, while Lily watched cartoons and Emma slept in with the dedication of someone who'd been storing sleep all week, he made coffee and called Darius at 8:30. I need more, he said. I figured, Darius said. Talk. He laid out the guardianship angle, the aunt in Scottsdale, the attorney who connected to the Luxembourg structure. He kept it tight and in order. When he finished, Darius was quiet for a moment. Judith Holloway, Darius said. Let me run that. Give me 2 hours. I have until 10. Then I'll need 90 minutes. Don't call me early. He didn't call early. He refilled his coffee and helped Lily reconstruct whatever diplomatic crisis had befallen the stuffed animals overnight. And at 10:03 his phone rang. The aunt received a wire transfer 11 days ago, Darius said. $750,000 from an account registered to a law firm in the Cayman Islands. The law firm is a known billing entity for the Luxembourg structure. A pause. She also received a separate communication, and this one I can't tell you how I know this, so don't ask. A communication that appears to have included personal financial information about her own past that she might prefer stay private. Old credit history. A bankruptcy from 2009 that was discharged but still public record if you knew where to look. They paid her and they pressured her, Caleb said. Best of both approaches. A pause. She probably told herself she's doing the right thing. People usually find a way to believe that. But she's being managed. Another pause. Here's the thing that matters. The wire transfer is documentable. It's in a Cayman account, but there's a correspondent bank in Miami that processed the intermediary transaction, and that bank is subject to U.S. regulatory oversight, which means the transfer record exists somewhere that a court order could reach. Caleb wrote that down. David Park can get that through civil discovery. If he moves fast enough. These accounts have a way of getting restructured when attention starts moving toward them. A pause. You have a narrow window. Days, not weeks. Understood. Anything else? A pause that held the quality of something being considered carefully. The principals upstream have noticed the rooftop situation didn't stay quiet. News coverage, the police investigation, the civil case, it's generated more exposure than they wanted. They're moving faster than their original timeline because of it. A pause. Which means they might make mistakes they wouldn't have made with more time. Fast operations have thinner margins. Or they decide the risk of the operation outweighs the return and they cut losses. Possible. But the broker-dealer license is worth enough to the people paying Vane that I don't think they cut yet. Darius paused. Be aware that faster timelines also mean less predictable next steps. Stay flexible. Always. Caleb. A pause. I'm going to say this once, and then I'm not going to say it again. If this thing is connected to the Caucasus network the way I think it is, these are not people who accept interference gracefully. The rooftop was impersonal. If they start feeling personally opposed, it gets different. I understand. Do you? Because you've got a 5-year-old who thinks small caterpillars aren't poisonous. Caleb looked at Lily on the couch, currently engaged in what appeared to be peace negotiations between the stuffed seal and the plastic dinosaur. I hear you, he said. Good. A pause. That's all I've got. Good luck. He called Sienna at 10:12 and told her everything except the part about how Darius had come by the information about the communication to Judith Holloway. She asked, and he said it wasn't something he could explain on this call, and she accepted that with the same pragmatic trust she'd been extending him since Friday lunch. The wire transfer, she said. If David can get the correspondent bank records, it undermines the petition's independence. A court sees that the petitioner received $750,000 from an entity connected to a party with a financial interest in the guardianship outcome. The petition has a standing problem. He paused. David needs to file for discovery on those records today. Not Monday. Today. It's Saturday. Judges have phones. A short pause. David is not going to love being called on a Saturday. David bills $900 an hour. He loves being called on Saturdays. Something in her voice shifted slightly. Okay, I'll call him. A pause. Caleb, the SEC complaint. Garrett Cole's credentials were used to export those financial documents. The timestamp on the export is 3 hours before his arrest, which means either he did it himself before the police got to him, or someone else accessed the system using his credentials without his knowledge. Is there a difference in the legal outcome? For Garrett, yes. For us, she paused. If someone else used his credentials, it means there's a fourth person we haven't identified. Someone who had access to Garrett's login information and knew to use it in the window before he was taken into custody. Fourth person. Caleb thought about that. Internal to your company? Or someone Garrett gave his credentials to voluntarily, as part of the arrangement? A pause. I've been going through the access logs with our IT security lead. There are 3 logins in the 48 hours before Tuesday night that used Garrett's credentials but originated from a device that isn't registered on our network. An external device accessing your system through Garrett's credentials. Yes, the IP address traces to a commercial VPN service, untraceable past that point. She paused. But the timing of those logins tells a story. The first one, 6 days before the gala, accessed the org chart and the executive security protocols. The second one, 2 days before, accessed the event planning files for the gala, layout, guest list, staffing assignments. The third one, the night before the gala, accessed the Q3 financial reports that ended up in the SEC complaint. He absorbed that sequence. They were planning the rooftop approach using your own security protocols. They knew the camera positions, the guard rotation, the layout of the terrace, because your head of security filed all of it in documents they could access. And they pulled the financial documents as a backup plan the night before the gala, already preparing for the possibility that Tuesday didn't go the way they wanted. A pause. This is a very organized operation. Yes, he said. It is. Does that worry you? He thought about it honestly. It means the people running it are experienced and they're careful. It also means there are records. Organized operations leave records. He paused. The IT access logs you just described, that's evidence. Dated, specific, showing premeditation across a 6-day window. That's the kind of thing that changes the character of a criminal case from opportunistic to coordinated. David will love that. He should. A pause. Sienna, I want to ask you something, and I need you to think about it carefully before you answer. A pause. Okay. Is there anyone else in your inner circle? Not the board, not legal, but the people you actually trust day to day? Who knew the details of your security setup? Who might have had access to information about Garrett Cole's credentials or your internal systems? A long silence. Longer than he expected. Priya has administrative access to my calendar and some of my files, she said slowly. But her access level doesn't include security protocols or financial reports. A pause. My finance director, Stephen Okafor, had access to the Q3 documents. He's been with the company for 6 years. I trust him. Another pause. My driver, Marco, has my daily schedule. Not system access, but he knows my movements. These aren't accusations, Caleb said. I'm just mapping who knew what. I understand. A pause. He was different this week, after Tuesday. He was attentive, which is normal, but he was also asking questions that weren't quite in his lane. About the investigation, about what the police had found. I noticed it, and I filed it away. She paused. I don't want it to be Stephen. Wanting doesn't change what's true. A silence. No. A pause. How do I find out? What does Stephen know right now about the status of the investigation and the legal strategy? David briefed a small group Tuesday morning. Stephen was in it. A pause. He knows about the civil filing. He knows about the SEC challenge. He doesn't know about the Luxembourg structure or the guardianship angle. That's been tightly held. Give him something that isn't true. Not a big thing. A specific detail about the timeline of the legal process. Something that sounds credible but is false. Something you'd only say in that small circle. He paused. If that detail shows up somewhere it shouldn't, you know where it went. She was quiet for a moment. That's a very cold thing to do to someone I've worked with for 6 years. Yes, he said. It is. Another silence. He heard her breathe. Okay, she said finally. I'll think about how to do it naturally. Don't overthink it. Something offhand in a working conversation. The more casual it sounds, the more believable. Okay. A pause. I'm going to call David. Thank you for the 10 o'clock call. Let me know what David gets from the bank records. She said she would, and the call ended, and he sat in the kitchen for a moment before Lily appeared in the doorway with the stuffed seal and an expression of great solemnity and said, Daddy, Gerald needs a bath. And he looked at the stuffed seal, whose name was apparently Gerald, and thought about the genuine Gerald Whitmore, and almost laughed. Okay, he said, let's give Gerald a bath. The weekend passed in the specific rhythm of his life. Lily's bath, and Emma's homework, and a grocery run, and a Saturday afternoon where Emma discovered a leak in the apartment ceiling that turned out to be from the unit above and required 2 hours of negotiation with the building manager. He fixed what he could fix, called in what he couldn't, made dinner, put Lily down, told Emma good night. Normal things, real things. The weight of the other situation sat in the background the way all weight sat in the background when you'd learned to compartmentalize, present, but contained, not spilling into the hours that belonged to his kids. Sunday evening, David Park called him directly for the first time. "Sienna gave me your number," David said, with the brisk efficiency of a man who had spent the weekend working and considered that normal. "The correspondent bank records. I filed an emergency ex parte motion this morning. Judge signed off this afternoon. The records show the wire transfer to Judith Holloway's personal account. The originating entity is a Cayman law firm that we can now connect to the Luxembourg structure through 2 intermediary entities." A pause. "I also ran Philip Crane, the attorney handling the guardianship petition. He's represented Luxembourg-linked entities in 3 prior matters. That's going to be in front of a judge Monday morning." "Oh, will the judge delay the petition?" "At minimum, we'll get a 30-day stay pending investigation of the petitioner's financial relationship with interested parties." A pause. "Which buys time on that front." Another pause, and his voice shifted slightly. "Mr. Ryder, I want to ask you directly. How are you getting the information you've been providing to Sienna?" Caleb had expected this. Former colleagues who have expertise in relevant areas. Are any of those colleagues currently employed in capacities that would make their information inadmissible or legally problematic? "No," Caleb said, which was true in the specific way that technically true things are sometimes true. A pause. "I'm going to accept that answer for now because the information has been accurate and actionable and we need every advantage we can get." Another pause. "But I want you to understand that if anything in this process gets challenged in court, the sourcing of the information is going to be examined." "I understand. The wire transfer and the bank records came through proper legal channels. The documentary evidence stands on its own." "Yes," David said. "It does." A pause. "Sienna trusts your judgment. I've been watching what you've contributed to this over the past several days, and I think her instinct is correct. But I want to make sure we're rowing in the same direction." "We are," Caleb said. "I want her company protected and the people behind this exposed. That's it." A pause. "All right. There's one more thing." David's voice took on a different quality. "The SEC complaint. We've been working the procedural challenge, but this afternoon our IT security lead confirmed what Sienna told me about the access logs, the premeditated credential use, the 6-day pattern, the external device." A pause. "He also found something that wasn't in the original review, a 5th login, 5 days before the gala. This one accessed a different part of the system, the board communication archive. They were reading the board's internal communications for at least several months based on the cookie data our IT lead recovered from the session, which means they knew the positions of every board member, every private discussion, every vulnerability." A pause. "Including specifically a private communication between Sienna and 2 board members from 4 months ago in which she expressed concern about the Meridian deal's timeline. A candid communication, the kind she wouldn't have sent if she'd known it was being read." Caleb thought about that. Can that communication be used against her? Not in a way she can't counter, but it gives the opposing board members ammunition in an internal vote. Context taken out of context, that kind of thing. A pause. "The board meeting is scheduled for Tuesday. Gerald's people will use Tuesday's meeting to introduce a confidence motion." A pause. 6 votes removes her from operational authority. Does Gerald have 6? He has 5 that we're certain of. The 6th is Elaine Torres. Elaine Torres, the recently appointed board member, Gerald's nominating process, carefully neutral. Has anyone talked to Torres directly? Sienna hasn't. She's been cautious about approaching her without more information. What do you know about her? She's a former CFO, financial services background, been on 2 other boards. Clean public record. No obvious connection to the Luxembourg structure or vein. A pause. But she was appointed through Gerald's process, and she knows which way the wind is blowing. Caleb thought about what he'd told Sienna. Don't assume hostile, but keep track of what she knows and when she learns it. What does Torres know about the Luxembourg angle? About what Vane was actually doing? Nothing that we know of. The board, broadly, has been told that Vane attempted to coerce Sienna on the rooftop. The criminal dimensions are publicly known, but the financial intelligence, the network, the broker-dealer license purpose, the offshore connections, that's been held tight. Then someone should tell her, Caleb said. Not everything, but enough. A pause. That's a significant step. If she's aligned with Gerald because she thinks this is a standard boardroom power struggle, showing her what it's actually connected to changes her calculation. She's a former CFO. She's not going to want her name on a board that knowingly participated in an operation for a foreign financial network. He paused. But if she's aligned with Gerald because she's already been approached and compromised, then you find that out when she takes what you tell her back to Gerald's camp. A silence on David's end. That's a gamble. Everything right now is a gamble. This one gives you information either way. Another pause. I'll raise it with Sienna. He called Sienna with the same information within the hour. She listened to the Torres angle and was quiet for a long time. If I'm wrong about her, Sienna said, and I go into that meeting Tuesday thinking I have 6 votes and I have 5, it's over. If you're right about her and you don't try, you go into Tuesday with 5. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's just the math. A pause. You'll know pretty quickly which way Torres sits. If you tell her the truth about what Vane was connected to, and her first call is to Gerald, that call happens in a window you can probably detect through your IT logs. You're already monitoring credential access. She picked that up immediately. If Gerald knows we've approached Torres within an hour of us doing it, we know she went to him. And if she calls you back instead, you might have your 6th vote. She thought about it. He could almost hear the calculation running. I need to meet her in person, not email, not a call. In person, where I can watch her face. Agreed. I'll reach out to her tonight. Try to set something for Monday morning. A pause. Caleb, the Stephen Okafor situation. I did what you suggested. I mentioned in a working meeting yesterday that the SEC challenge was expected to conclude in about 5 days, which is not the actual timeline David gave me. The real answer is 3 weeks. A pause. This morning, I got a call from David saying that Philip Crane, the aunt's attorney, called him with a comment suggesting that the SEC matter would be resolved quickly. He used the phrase within the week. Caleb felt the coldness of that settle. Stephen told Crane. Within 24 hours of the meeting, her voice was very controlled. Stephen Okafor has been with me for 6 years. He came to my father's hospital the night of the stroke. He helped me understand the financial picture when I took over. A pause. He sat across from me yesterday and watched me talk about the company's future and went home and made a phone call. Caleb said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. How do I handle it? She said. He can't know that I know, not before Tuesday. You need him to believe everything is normal until the board meeting is over. After Tuesday, it doesn't matter what he knows. He paused. Can you do that? Act normal with him until then? A pause. I spent 3 years presenting quarterly results to a board that was quietly trying to undermine me while smiling at my projections. Yes, I can act normal. Okay, he paused. Monday. Torres meeting, David files the guardianship challenge, you keep Stephen in the dark. Tuesday. Board meeting. What do you need between now and Monday? She was quiet for a moment. I need to not be alone with all of this for a few hours. He hadn't expected that. Not the admission. She wasn't someone who admitted things without deciding to, which meant she'd decided to. He stayed with it for a second. My kids have a thing tomorrow afternoon, he said. Emma's school. She's running the backstage crew for the drama department's spring program. It's about an hour. A pause. You could come if you wanted something that has nothing to do with any of this. A long silence. You're inviting me to a school play. Spring program. Emma would correct you on that. Another silence. Caleb, I haven't been to anything like that in I don't know how long. A pause. I wouldn't be imposing. Lily will try to sit in your lap within the first 5 minutes. That's not imposing. That's just Lily. He paused. And Emma's good. She actually is. The backstage stuff. She has a real instinct for it. She was quiet for a moment. What time? 3 o'clock. I can text you the address. Okay, she said. And then, slightly softer, thank you. He sent her the address and set the phone down and sat in the kitchen quiet and tried to think about whether he'd just made a professional mistake or a personal one or something that didn't fit either category. He decided the category question could wait. He checked on the kids, turned off the kitchen light, and went to tell Emma that they'd have a guest tomorrow, which produced a 12-year-old's assessment that lasted about 45 seconds before Emma said, "Is she nice?" And he said yes, and Emma said fine, with the studied indifference that meant she was going to think about it all night. Lily, when he checked on her, was asleep with Gerald the stuffed seal and the plastic dinosaur both tucked under one arm, apparently having reached a settlement, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her and thinking about everything that was coming on Monday and Tuesday, and how none of it touched this specific room, this specific moment, this small person asleep with her diplomatic coalition of stuffed animals. Then he went to the couch and lay down, and this time he actually slept. He dreamed about nothing he remembered in the morning, which was the best kind of dream. Sienna arrived at the school auditorium 7 minutes before 3, which meant she was early, which meant she was nervous, which was not a thing she admitted to herself until she was already standing in the parking lot of a middle school in Hialeah, looking at a hand-painted banner that read, Miami Springs Middle School Spring Program, Sunday. 3 p.m. in colors that had dripped slightly at the edges. She was wearing jeans. She'd changed 3 times before leaving the house, which was absurd, and she knew it was absurd, and she'd done it anyway. She'd ended up in jeans and a light jacket and flat shoes, which was the most normal outfit she owned, which told her something about her life she didn't have time to examine right now. Caleb was standing near the entrance with Lily on his hip, which was where Lily apparently lived. He spotted Sienna crossing the parking lot and raised a hand in the simple way of someone who isn't performing anything, just marking a location, and she walked toward them and felt something in her chest do something she didn't have a word for. "You came," he said. "You invited me." Lily looked at her with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 5-year-old. "You're pretty," she announced. "Thank you," Sienna said. "So are you." Lily considered this for a moment with the seriousness of someone evaluating a business proposal, then apparently decided it was acceptable and reached out both arms towards Sienna in the universal gesture of a small child who has decided to be held. Caleb looked faintly alarmed. "Lily, she might not—" "It's okay," Sienna said, and took her, and Lily settled against her shoulder with the complete boneless trust of someone who had never once in her life doubted that the world would catch her. And Sienna stood in the parking lot of a middle school holding a 5-year-old she'd met 45 seconds ago and thought that this might be the strangest and most uncomplicated she'd felt in months. They found seats in the 3rd row. The auditorium smelled like cleaning product and old curtain fabric, and the specific excitement of children waiting to perform. Parents filed in around them with the harried purposefulness of people who had driven across the city on a Sunday afternoon and were determined to document every moment of it. Caleb sat next to Sienna with Lily between them, which lasted about 4 minutes before Lily migrated fully onto Sienna's lap, and Caleb gave her an apologetic look, and she shook her head slightly because it was fine. It genuinely was, and she couldn't entirely explain why. The program started late, because school programs always start late, and when the lights went down and the curtain moved and the first group of 7th graders walked out onto the stage, Caleb leaned slightly forward, and she understood that he was looking for Emma, who was not on the stage but somewhere behind it, which was the point. What followed was an hour of imperfect, genuine, earnest performance. Kids who forgot lines and recovered, a microphone that cut out twice, a costume malfunction in the second act that someone handled with impressive composure, a musical number that was slightly off-tempo and completely committed. The kind of thing that exists only in the real world, not in any version of entertainment that gets polished before it reaches you. Sienna hadn't been to anything like it since she was a child herself. She'd forgotten what it felt like to watch people do something that mattered to them without any of the protective armor of professionalism. She found herself genuinely moved by it in a way she hadn't been prepared for, which was embarrassing, and then she decided she didn't care that it was embarrassing. At the end, when the cast came out for their bow and the backstage crew was invited out as well, Emma appeared from the wings, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, but also like she was trying not to smile. She was tall for 12, with the specific kind of self-contained dignity that some kids develop early as a way of navigating a world that has already asked too much of them. She stood at the end of the backstage row and accepted the applause with a small, controlled nod, and Caleb put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, which made Emma close her eyes briefly with the mortification of a 12-year-old whose father has just embarrassed her in public, which meant everything was normal. Lily clapped both hands above her head on Sienna's lap and yelled, "Emma!" at a volume that suggested she'd been saving it. After, in the lobby, Emma moved through the crowd toward them with the focused efficiency of someone who wants to complete a task. She looked at Sienna with the direct, measuring quality of someone who had her father's eyes and her own entirely independent judgment. "This is Sienna," Caleb said. "I know who she is," Emma said. "You were at the hotel thing." "The hotel thing," Sienna said. "Yes." Emma looked at her for a moment. "Dad said you're dealing with a lot." "That's one way to put it." "He says that about everything." Emma looked at her father briefly, then back at Sienna. "Did you actually like it, the program? You can say if it was boring. We had a microphone issue." "I thought it was genuinely good," Sienna said. "The recovery on the microphone was impressive. Who made that call?" Emma blinked. "I did. We had a backup track." "Good instinct." A pause. Emma's expression shifted by maybe 2 degrees in a direction that might have been approval or might have been the beginning of considering approval, which in a 12-year-old was essentially the same thing. "Thanks," she said, and then she grabbed Lily off Sienna's hip because apparently Lily's diplomatic mission was complete, and it was time to go find out if there were cookies in the lobby, which there were. Caleb stood next to Sienna, and they watched the 2 of them navigate toward the refreshment table, Emma managing Lily with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it since she was 7. "She's remarkable," Sienna said. She meant it. "She works at it," he said. "Emma doesn't do anything halfway." A pause. "She gets that from her mother." They stood in the lobby noise for a moment, and it was the first time since Tuesday that neither of them was thinking about Marcus Vane or Luxembourg structures or board votes, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Then Sienna's phone buzzed in her pocket, and the moment folded back into everything else. It was David. She looked at Caleb. "I have to take this." "Go," he said. She stepped toward the lobby doors and answered. David's voice had the particular quality it got when something had moved significantly. "The guardianship hearing," he said. "The judge reviewed the financial connection between Judith Holloway and the Cayman entity this morning. He's not just issuing a stay. He's referred the petition to the state attorney's office for investigation of potential elder financial abuse. The petition is effectively dead." She closed her eyes for half a second. "That's the guardianship. Gone," David confirmed. "Now, the SEC matter. The procedural challenge is holding, but there's something else. The SEC's own enforcement division reached out to me this afternoon, informally. They received a referral from Treasury's Financial Crimes Division about the Luxembourg structure, and they are independently interested in the origin of the complaint against Holloway Group. They want to know who filed it and how they got the documents." A pause. "Which means the weapon they built to use against you is now being examined as evidence against them." She turned this over. "The IT access logs. I'm sending them to the SEC contact first thing Monday." A pause. "Sienna, the momentum has shifted. It's not over. Tuesday's board meeting is still critical. But the legal scaffolding they built around the company is coming apart." Another pause, and his voice dropped slightly. "I also heard from an FBI contact. Not officially, not yet, but they've opened a preliminary inquiry into Vane Capital Partners' acquisition patterns in connection with the Treasury referral. This is becoming federal." "How does that affect Tuesday?" "If the board knows that a federal inquiry is opening into Vane, the calculation for anyone who is considering a confidence vote against you changes dramatically. Nobody wants to be the board member who voted to remove the CEO of a company that was the target of a foreign financial network right before the FBI opened an investigation." A pause. "Gerald's camp is going to know about the federal inquiry by Monday afternoon." "That's not a leak." It'll be in the legal press. And when they know the 6 votes he was counting on might not all stay 6, she breathed. Elaine Torres. Meet with her Monday morning like you planned. But the conversation is going to be different than it would have been yesterday. She thanked him and ended the call and stood outside the lobby doors for a moment in the Sunday afternoon air. The sounds of the parking lot and the distant traffic and the muffled noise of the lobby behind her, and let herself feel the very careful, provisional thing that felt like the beginning of relief. She went back inside and found Caleb near the refreshment table watching Lily negotiate a second cookie with the solemnity of a UN mediator, and she stood next to him and said quietly, "The guardianship petition is dead. The SEC inquiry is turning back on the people who filed it. A federal inquiry into Vane is opening." He nodded slowly, not triumphantly, just absorbing it, the way he absorbed everything, without performance. "Tuesday is still the board," she said. "Tuesday is still the board," he agreed, but the ground shifted. She looked at him. The lobby was loud around them, kids and parents and the specific cheerful chaos of a Sunday afternoon school event, and he was standing in the middle of it with his hands in his pockets looking like exactly what he was. A man who had just watched his daughter's spring program and was about to take his kids home for dinner. "Thank you," she said. It felt insufficient, and she said it anyway. He looked at her for a moment. "For what specifically?" "For all of it." A pause. "For not walking away after Tuesday night." "You didn't ask me to stay." "No," she said. "I didn't." A pause. "I was afraid to." He looked at her, and something in his face was quieter than usual, less guarded, the way people get in the middle of ordinary Sunday afternoons when the armor they wear for the rest of the week has temporarily somewhere else to be. "I need to get these 2 home," he said. "Lily has a bedtime and Emma has homework she's pretending she already finished." "Of course." She took a step back. "I'll call you tonight about Torres." "Okay." She turned to go, and Lily said, "Sienna," from the refreshment table at full volume, and she turned back, and Lily waved both arms, and she waved back, and Emma caught her eye and did the small controlled nod that was apparently Emma's version of a wave, and Sienna walked out of the auditorium into the Sunday afternoon with something warm sitting in her chest that she didn't immediately try to name. Monday arrived with the specific urgency of a day that had been waiting all weekend. Sienna met Elaine Torres at 7:30 in the morning at a coffee place in Coconut Grove that Elaine had suggested. A small, independent spot, not the kind of place where financial news traveled, which told Sienna something about Elaine's instincts before they'd exchanged a word. Elaine Torres was 54, silver-haired, with the composed manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where she was the only woman and had made her peace with it without making her peace with what caused it. She ordered black coffee and looked at Sienna across the table with eyes that were measuring and not unfriendly. "I wondered when you'd call," Elaine said. "I should have called sooner." "Yes." No elaboration, just the acknowledgement, honest and brief. Sienna laid it out. All of it. The Luxembourg structure, the broker-dealer license, what the network was actually trying to use Holloway Group for, the Treasury investigation that had been killed, the witness who'd disappeared, the pattern of Vane's previous acquisitions. She watched Elaine's face as she spoke, the way a particular stillness settled in when the information hit a certain weight. When she finished, Elaine was quiet for a long moment. She turned her coffee cup slowly on the table. "Gerald told me," Elaine said carefully, "that you were in over your head, that the succession had been poorly managed and that the company needed mature leadership." A pause. "He framed it as protecting the company." "And what did you think?" Another pause. "I thought it was possible. I've seen successions go badly, and I didn't know you well enough to have a firm opinion." She looked up. "I also thought the timing felt orchestrated, but I didn't have enough information to know in which direction." "You have it now." "I have your version." "I know," Sienna said. "I'm also not asking you to take my word alone. David Park will speak with you directly. The SEC referral is going to be public by end of day. The federal inquiry into Vane Capital will be in the legal press by tomorrow morning." She paused. "I'm asking you to make a decision about what you want your name attached to." Elaine looked at her for a long moment. "What was Gerald offered?" "We believe financial arrangements and protection of certain aspects of his business history. The specifics are still being documented. A pause. I don't know if he understood what he was actually working for, or if he convinced himself it was legitimate. That distinction is going to matter for him legally. It doesn't change what Tuesday's vote is about. Elaine nodded slowly. There's a fourth board member you should know about, she said. Carol Shen. She's been in Gerald's camp publicly, but I've known Carol for 15 years, and she's been uncomfortable. She asked me 2 weeks ago whether I thought the situation felt right, and I didn't have enough information to answer her. Elaine paused. If Carol knows what you've just told me, you might have 7 votes, not 6. Sienna absorbed that. Can you reach her today? I can reach her before noon. A pause. Sienna, I want to be honest with you about something. I took this board seat because the opportunity was professionally interesting and because Gerald's recruitment was flattering. I didn't do adequate due diligence on why the seat was available when it was, or why I was being approached specifically. A pause. That was my failure. I'm not asking you to overlook it. I'm not overlooking it. I'm working with what I have. Sienna looked at her steadily. I need the vote Tuesday. After that, you and I will need to have a longer conversation about how this board functions going forward. Fair, Elaine said. That's fair. They left the coffee place at 8:45. Sienna sat in her car and called Caleb. Torres is with us, she said, and she thinks Carol Shen might be reachable. A pause. That's 7 potential votes. If Elaine can get to Carol before noon, and Carol is actually where Elaine thinks she is, she exhaled. And if Gerald doesn't hear about the Torres conversation before tomorrow, he'll hear about it eventually. The question is whether he has time to counter it. He paused. What's his likely move when he realizes the vote count is going against him? She thought about it. Delay. He'll try to table the confidence motion and buy time, call for an external review, a governance assessment, something procedural that postpones the vote. A pause. Which I need to be prepared for, because if it gets tabled, the federal inquiry opening doesn't help me. It just creates more uncertainty for the board to hide behind. Can you prevent a tabling motion? David and I talked about this. The board charter requires a 2/3 majority to table a motion once it's been formally introduced. If Gerald introduces the confidence motion and I have 6 votes against, I can block the tabling. She paused. But it requires Gerald to introduce it, which he might not do if he knows the count is going against him. Then make sure he doesn't know until he's already introduced it, which means containing the information about Torres and Shen until Tuesday morning. Elaine understands that. She understood it before I said it. A pause. She's sharp. I should have approached her weeks ago. You didn't have the right information weeks ago. A pause. No, I didn't. She started the car. Caleb, Stephen Okafor, I need to decide what to do about him before Tuesday. Does he have any involvement in Tuesday's board process? Access to board documentation? Vote preparation? He's on the finance team, not the board secretariat. He doesn't have a role in Tuesday's mechanics. A pause. But he's been in every strategy meeting. He knows everything we've done to prepare except the Torres and Shen outreach. Then keep him out of anything that happens between now and Tuesday close of business. After Tuesday, you deal with it properly, with HR and legal and documentation. Not before, because if you move on him before the vote and he knows he's been caught, the reaction is unpredictable. I've been acting normal in meetings with him for 4 days, she said. I can do 2 more. I know you can. She pulled out of the parking lot. After Tuesday, she said, whatever happens, I need you to know that what you've done in the last 10 days, I don't have a framework for it. He was quiet for a moment. You would have figured it out. Maybe. Slower. And I would have missed the broker-dealer angle entirely until it was too late. A pause. You saw the whole picture when I was still looking at the frame. That's just pattern recognition. You would have gotten there. Caleb, she stopped at a light. Stop deflecting. A pause. Then simply, okay. She smiled at the road ahead. Okay, she said. I'll call you tonight. Tuesday morning arrived the way all consequential mornings arrive, the same as every other morning, requiring the same things, indifferent to what was about to happen. Caleb dropped Lily at daycare at 7:30 and Emma at school at 7:50 and was at the Aurelius pool station by 8:15. He ran the chemical tests. He logged the readings. He adjusted the pH in lane 3, which kept being slightly off in a way that suggested a calibration issue with the testing kit rather than an actual chemical problem, but he logged it both ways to be thorough. At 9:40, his phone buzzed. Sienna. Elaine confirmed Carol Shen. We have 7. Board meeting at 11. I'll call you after. He set the phone back in his pocket and went back to the readings. At 11:05, across the city in a conference room on the 28th floor of Holloway Group's headquarters building, Gerald Whitmore walked into the board meeting to find that the composition of the room was different than what his calculations had prepared him for. Carol Shen, who had been reliably in his camp for the past 8 months, was seated on the wrong side of the table's informal geography. Elaine Torres was not making eye contact with him, which was itself a kind of answer. He understood in the first 2 minutes that the vote count had moved. He spent the next 5 minutes trying to assess by how much. He introduced the confidence motion at 11:18 because the alternative was to not introduce it and have it appear that the motion had been abandoned, which would be its own signal to the people he'd been working with, and he needed to appear, at minimum, to have prosecuted the strategy. Sienna let him make the full argument. She sat at the head of the table and listened to Gerald outline his concerns about strategic direction and leadership continuity and the company's position following the events of the past 2 weeks. And she let him finish, and then she spoke for 4 minutes. She didn't attack Gerald. She didn't perform outrage. She presented the board with a specific, factual summary of what had been uncovered in the 10 days since the gala: the orchestrated attack, the internal compromise through Garrett Cole, the SEC complaint and its origin in credentials stolen through Cole's access, the guardianship petition, and its connection to a Cayman entity linked to a Luxembourg holding structure currently under federal inquiry, and the pattern of Vane Capital Partners acquisitions and their ultimate financial purpose. She kept her voice even throughout. She placed a folder in front of each board member that contained the key documentary evidence David had assembled. She gave them 60 seconds to look at it before she said, "The motion before us is a confidence vote. I'd like the board to consider what it means to remove the CEO of a company that has just been established as the target of a foreign financial network, 1 week before a federal inquiry opens." She paused. "I'd also like the board to consider what it means to do nothing." Then she called the vote, 7-2. Gerald Whitmore and 1 other voted in favor of the confidence motion. Everyone else voted against. Carol Shen voted against with the specific focused energy of someone resolving something that had been uncomfortable for weeks. The motion failed. David Park, sitting in as legal counsel, noted the result for the record. Gerald Whitmore left the room without speaking to anyone. The board member who'd voted with him, a man named Thomas Ridley, who had been in Gerald's orbit for a decade, gathered his folder and followed. What remained in the room was 7 board members who had just voted to confirm the authority of a 30-year-old CEO against a coordinated campaign by a foreign financial network. And they sat there for a moment in the particular quiet that follows a significant decision, and then Elaine Torres said, "I'd like to move that we commission an independent governance review, beginning with the nominating process for recent board appointments." And Sienna seconded it, and it passed unanimously. Sienna walked out of the board meeting at 12:41 and sat in a chair in the hallway outside the conference room and called Caleb. 7-2, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the pool in the background, the water sounds, the distant voices of the lunch crowd. "Good," he said. That was it. Just good, in the way of someone for whom that was a complete sentence. She laughed, a real one, short and slightly undone. "That's all you've got? What do you want me to say?" Something more than good would be acceptable. A pause. "You walked into a room where the vote was already supposed to be decided against you, and you changed it." Another pause. "That's not something most people can do. You should probably let yourself feel it for a minute before the next thing starts." She sat in the hallway and let herself feel it. The carpet was that institutional gray-blue that all commercial hallways seem to have agreed upon at some point, and the overhead lighting was too bright, and somewhere down the hall a printer was running. It was the most ordinary hallway in the world, and she had just held her company, and she was on the phone with a man who'd been a lifeguard a week and a half ago, and everything was extremely strange and also, somehow, fine. "There's still a lot left," she said. There always is. The federal inquiry, the civil case against Vane rebuilding the security structure. A pause. Finding out how deep the board compromise actually goes. All of that's real, he agreed. It's also all tomorrow's problem, or next week's. A pause. Today, you got the vote. She leaned her head back against the wall. What are you doing right now? Chemical test on lane 3. The pH is still off. Existential. In the grand scheme, yeah. She heard a small sound that might have been a laugh. You should eat something. You probably haven't eaten since this morning. I had coffee. That's not food. It gets me through most days. It shows, he said, and she laughed again, and it felt like something unclenching. I want to take you to dinner, she said. Tonight. Somewhere that has actual food, not Marta's coffee. A pause. Is this professional dinner or another kind of dinner? She thought about not answering that directly, and then thought about how they'd gotten to this point by being direct with each other and said, the second kind. Another pause, longer. She waited. My neighbor can sit with the kids until 8, he said. I'll make a reservation. Somewhere I can wear what I own. I'll find somewhere. Sienna. A pause. Today was good. I mean that in the full sense. She knew he did. I know, she said. 8 o'clock. I'll text you the address. She ended the call and sat in the hallway for another 30 seconds, alone with the ordinary carpet and the 2 bright lights and the sound of the printer down the hall, and she thought about the past 11 days and the strange geometry of how they'd moved. From a rooftop confrontation to a corporate conspiracy to a school parking lot to a board vote, and how none of it had followed the path she would have predicted, which was perhaps the point, or perhaps not a point at all, just the way things went when the world refused to cooperate with your expectations. She got up. She had work to do. The federal inquiry into Vane Capital Partners was formally opened the following Thursday. The SEC, working in coordination with Treasury's Financial Crimes Unit, issued a preservation order on all Vane Capital records and accounts. Marcus Vane's attorneys filed an immediate motion to limit the scope, which the presiding judge reviewed and largely denied. Garrett Cole, in custody and facing charges that were now considerably more serious than initially filed, accepted a proffer agreement. What he told investigators over the course of 2 sessions expanded the picture of the operation in ways that David Park described to Sienna as significantly useful, and that Sienna privately understood meant that Garrett, frightened and looking at a long sentence, had given them the architecture of the whole network. He'd been approached 14 months ago, not by Vane directly, but by an intermediary, a man who'd contacted him through a professional security firm, cultivated a relationship over several months, and eventually made him an offer. The offer had been structured carefully, framed initially as consulting work, background information only. By the time Garrett understood what he was actually part of, he'd accepted enough money and provided enough information that the path back out was no longer clear. He hadn't known about the Luxembourg connection. He hadn't known about the offshore network or the broker-dealer license or what the ultimate plan for Holloway Group was. He'd known that powerful people wanted something from the company and that his job was to make access easier. That was all. He told himself that what happened next wasn't his responsibility. That was the thing about the people in the middle of operations like this. They almost never knew the whole picture. They knew their piece, and they found reasons to believe their piece was acceptable, and they didn't look too hard at what their piece was connected to. Gerald Whitmore resigned from the board 11 days after the confidence vote. He released a statement through his lawyer citing personal reasons and expressing gratitude for his years of service. He did not mention Marcus Vane or the Luxembourg structure or the conversations he'd had with Philip Crane, which were now in the possession of federal investigators. His own lawyer had advised him strongly to resign and cooperate, and he'd taken that advice with the speed of a man who understood what cooperation was worth. Thomas Ridley resigned the same day, same language, same speed. The board seats were left vacant pending the independent governance review that Elaine Torres was chairing. Elaine, who had started as a question mark and resolved into something considerably more solid, ran the review with the methodical efficiency of a former CFO, who understood that getting the structure right was the work that protected everything else. It was unglamorous work. She did it anyway. Stephen Okafor was placed on administrative leave the day after the board vote, when HR and David Park were both in position to handle it properly. The meeting was brief and documented and conducted without accusation. He was told that the company was conducting a security review of all systems access and that his administrative access was being suspended pending the review's outcome. He left the building without creating a scene, which told Sienna something about what he'd been expecting. People who are genuinely surprised tend to argue. People who have been waiting for something tend to just get up and go. The full scope of what Stephen had provided would take investigators weeks to establish. But the early picture was consistent with what the access logs had shown. He'd been a secondary node, providing financial intelligence to someone above him who'd passed it on. Like Garrett, he'd known his piece and not looked too hard at what it connected to. Judith Holloway, Sienna's aunt in Scottsdale, withdrew the guardianship petition before the state attorney's investigation formally opened. Her attorney, Philip Crane, was named in the federal civil complaint as a knowing participant in the coordination effort. Judith herself was not charged, but she was interviewed twice, and the $750,000 in her account became part of the documented financial trail. Sienna visited her father 3 days after the board vote. She drove herself to the care facility in Coral Gables on a Wednesday afternoon and sat with him in the garden for an hour, in the particular quiet that had developed between them over 11 months. A quiet that wasn't comfortable and wasn't uncomfortable, just the specific texture of their relationship as it was now. After the stroke had taken the version of him she'd known and left this quieter, slower version who still knew her face and sometimes didn't have words for anything else. She told him about the gala. She told him about the rooftop and the vote and the investigation. She didn't know how much he understood. He listened the way he listened to most things now, with a focused, patient attention that might have been comprehension and might have been just the concentration of someone trying very hard to follow a story that kept moving faster than he could track. When she finished, he said, "You handled it." Not a question, just a recognition. "I had help," she said. He nodded slowly. "That's different than it used to be." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden, at the bougainvillea on the far wall that had gone deeply, extravagantly pink in the afternoon sun. "Yeah," she said. "It is." She sat with him until the light changed, and then she drove home. The dinner on the Tuesday of the board vote had been at a restaurant in Wynwood that Sienna had found specifically because it had good food and booths in the back that didn't require a reservation 3 weeks out, and where the lighting was warm without trying too hard. Caleb had arrived in a dark shirt and clean jeans, and the specific expression of someone who had made an effort and was hoping it was the right amount. It had been the right amount. They'd talked for 3 hours. Not about the company, not about the investigation, not about any of the things that had been the connective tissue of their relationship for the past 10 days. They talked about Emma's plan to direct a full production rather than just backstage crew next year, and whether that was ambition or optimism or both. They talked about Rachel, not in a heavy way, but in the way that becomes possible when some time has passed and the grief has changed its shape without disappearing. When you can say a person's name and remember who they were rather than just the absence of them. They talked about Sienna's father and the specific difficulty of loving someone who is present and also somehow gone. They talked about what it cost to be responsible for things. Companies, children, people who depended on decisions made in conference rooms and on rooftops and in quiet conversations that no one else ever saw. Caleb had told her, over the last of the wine he'd drunk slowly and she'd matched him on, that the thing he'd thought about most in the past week wasn't the rooftop or the investigation, but the school play. The spring program. The way Emma had done her controlled nod, and Lily had waved both arms, and Sienna had waved back without self-consciousness, like it was the most natural thing. "Why that?" she'd asked. He'd taken a moment. "Because it was just a moment. Nothing was at stake. There was no play and no next move. It was just..." He'd paused. "Real, normal. The kind of thing I've been trying to build toward for 4 years and keep not quite arriving at." She'd understood that. She told him she understood it because she'd been trying to build toward the same thing from a completely different direction. And maybe that was the thing about people who carried too much. They all eventually started looking for a place to set it down. And the hardest part was that the place had to be chosen, not found. They'd left the restaurant at 11 and stood in the parking lot with the Wynwood murals loud and vivid on the walls around them, and he'd said her name once, just that, and she'd looked at him, and the thing that happened then was neither dramatic nor smooth. It was uncertain and a little bit careful and entirely honest, the way first things are when they actually mean something. 6 weeks after the board vote, Sienna made 2 announcements. The first was public. Holloway Group was proceeding with the Meridian acquisition. The deal closed on the timeline she'd projected, bringing in 2 new board seats and the strategic positioning she'd been working toward for 11 months. The company's stock, which had been volatile in the weeks of the investigation's public phases, stabilized and then moved higher. The second announcement was internal. The company was creating a new position, Director of Corporate Security and Risk Intelligence, reporting directly to the CEO. The role would oversee not just physical security, but the information security architecture, the threat assessment process, and the protocols for identifying and responding to coordinated external pressure on the company's governance. Caleb accepted the position on a Monday morning in an office that had a view of the bay and a schedule that was written into his contract with specific language. Tuesday and Thursday were school pickup days. He left at 2:15. That was non-negotiable, and Sienna had put it in the contract herself before offering it to him, which was the thing he'd thought about most when deciding whether to say yes. He told Emma and Lily about the job change on a Sunday night, at the kitchen table over the dinner he'd made. Emma looked at the bay view in the photo Sienna had sent and said, "That's a lot nicer than the pool," in a tone that suggested she approved without being willing to say so directly. Lily said, "Will there be a swimming pool?" And when he said there was one in the building, she nodded with the complete satisfaction of someone whose priorities are clear and whose world is therefore in order. He gave notice at the Aurelius on a Tuesday. Donna, who managed the aquatics program and who had been quietly watching Caleb Ryder's situation evolve for 10 days with the baffled attention of someone who'd ended up in the middle of something they hadn't signed up for, shook his hand and said she was glad things had worked out, and she hoped the new job had better coffee than the pool station, and he said there was no guarantee of that. He cleaned out the locker, the backup uniform he'd kept there, the extra chemical kit, the clipboard with the 3 months of pH readings that he'd pass on to whoever covered his stations. He stood at the pool for a few minutes before leaving. The water was very blue and very still. Lane 3's pH was slightly off, which it always was. He walked out. The rooftop at the Aurelius was rented for private events most nights. On a Friday in late April, about 6 weeks after the board vote, Sienna's office received a request from a charity foundation to use the space for a donor dinner. The hotel's events team handled it, which was their job, and the rooftop was set up the way it always was for events like this. String lights, white linen, the jazz quartet, if budget allowed. Sienna and Caleb were not at that dinner. They were at Emma's school for the meeting about next year's drama production that Emma had requested they both attend, which they had, and which Emma had conducted with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and was prepared to make the case for it. Afterward, the 4 of them, Sienna had become the 4 of them, gradually and then all at once, the way most true things happen, had gone to get ice cream, which was Lily's chosen venue for all significant occasions. Lily had ordered something with 3 colors and consumed it with total commitment. Emma had eaten hers with the considered pacing of someone trying to make it last. Caleb had looked at the 3 of them across the table in the ice cream place in Hialeah, in the bright fluorescent light, with the sticky table and the chairs that didn't match, and the sound of traffic outside, and felt something that he didn't have better words for than this. Just this. The ordinary, imperfect, ongoing fact of this. Sienna had looked at him and known what he was thinking, the way she'd learned to read him the same way he'd learned to read rooms. Not perfectly, not always, but often enough to matter. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said back. Lily said, "Why are you looking at each other like that?" Emma said, "Because they're grown-ups, and grown-ups are weird," and went back to her ice cream. Lily considered this assessment. "Okay," she said, and returned to the 3-color project with renewed dedication. There was no version of what happened next that was clean or finished or without complication. There were still depositions to give in the civil case against Vane, which would take years. There were board meetings every quarter where the governance review's recommendations were slowly implemented, which was slower than Sienna wanted and faster than some people thought possible, which meant it was probably about right. There were days when the company moved exactly where she needed it to move and days when it didn't, and she was learning, slowly, to tell the difference between the things she could control and the things she could only prepare for. There were Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at 2:15 that were not negotiable, and that fact was written into a contract, and the contract sat in a file. And that file was one of the things Caleb felt most settled about in the new geography of his life. There were dinners, some of them at restaurants and some of them at the kitchen table in Hialeah, which had become Sienna's preferred location because it was the most real place she knew. Emma had opinions about everything they cooked and was developing the ability to express those opinions with precision, which was either alarming or promising depending on how you looked at it. Lily had decided that Sienna was permanently in her diplomatic coalition alongside Gerald the stuffed seal and the plastic dinosaur, which was the highest honor Lily could confer. There was Rachel's photograph on the shelf in the apartment, which stayed where it was, because she was Emma and Lily's mother, and she belonged in the room. And Sienna understood that without being told, which was one of the first things Caleb had trusted about her judgment. There was a woman learning that strength didn't require isolation, that asking for help wasn't the same as conceding weakness, that the parts of herself she'd sealed off to survive the last 3 years of building something without anyone to build it with her were parts she was slowly, carefully opening back up. There was a man learning that the thing he'd been trying to build toward, the ordinary, present, uncomplicated life, wasn't something you arrived at and then stayed in. It was something you chose every day, in the small decisions, the 2:15 school pickups, and the dinner tables, and the ice cream places, and the school plays, and that the choosing was the thing, not the arrival. There were two people who had come to each other from completely different directions and found, in the strange and improbable intersection of a rooftop and a conspiracy and a spring program, something worth being careful with. Not perfect, not finished, not without the particular weight of everything they'd both carried to get here, but real, ongoing, chosen, every day, with eyes open. That was enough. Some days it was more than enough. The city moved below them, indifferent and enormous, the way cities do, and they were in it together, making their way forward in the only way anyone ever actually makes their way forward, one ordinary day at a time, imperfect and alive.